Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Now beginning, Story 1. The quiet shores of Vinland, Norsemen on the edge of the world. You lie back, breathe slowly, and let yourself drift not just into sleep, but into the cold North Atlantic, sometime around the year 1000 CE. This is not the age of Columbus. No charts of latitude and longitude, no monarch-funded fleets. Instead, there are longships, clinker-built from oak and pine, their prows rising like dragon heads above the sea spray. On these long and narrow vessels, men in cloaks and fur huddle against the wind. They come from a place called Greenland, but it is not green and barely land. It is ice-rimmed and wind-lashed. The farms are poor. The growing season is short. There are whispers of richer lands to the west. Some call it Vinland. You may be familiar with the idea that Vikings discovered America, that they arrived centuries before Columbus. But what you may not know is how staggeringly ordinary these journeys were, at least to the Norse themselves. Not the stuff of epic conquest, but of family relocation, timber collection, and a little hopeful colonizing. Let's step back for a moment. Who are these people, really? The Norse of the 10th and 11th centuries were not quite the Vikings of legend. By the time they reached the western edges of the Atlantic, they were settlers more than raiders. Farmers, traders, carpenters, blacksmiths, and shipwrights. They lived in tight-knit communities that followed Norse laws and customs with meticulous care. Eric the Red had established Greenland's eastern settlement in the late 10th century after being exiled from Iceland for murder. It was a place of rugged survival, dependent on walrus ivory and drifting ice. But Eric's son, Leif Erikson, heard tales from a trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had reportedly sighted land far to the west after being blown off course. Bjarni never landed, but Leif, known even in the sagas as Leif the Lucky, decided to go see for himself. This is how the sagas tell it, but the sagas, of course, are written later centuries after the events they describe. Still, something happened, something small and slow and vastly underwhelming, and it shaped history in a whisper. The voyage. To get to what the Norse would call Vinland, Leif sailed from Bradalith, a Norse settlement in southern Greenland. The route was long and uncertain. First to a place he called Helluland, land of the flat stones, likely Baffin Island. Then to Markland, land of forests, probably the Labrador coast. Finally, to Vinland itself, thought by many scholars to be somewhere along the northern coast of Newfoundland. They were sailing blind, without maps or precise measurements. Navigation was done by sunstone, the flight of birds, the smell of seaweed, the taste of the air. The Norse were masters of what could be called environmental reading. They observed driftwood, ocean currents, the appearance of clouds on the horizon. It wasn't precise, but it was effective. They reached a place where the grass was soft underfoot, where wild grapes, or at least berries mistaken for grapes, grew in abundance, where the winters were milder than Greenland. There were trees, so many trees. For a people starved of lumber in their treeless Arctic settlements, this was something close to paradise. Vinland, a land of timber and possibility. But what was Vinland, really? It wasn't a new kingdom. It wasn't even a permanent settlement. Leif and his small crew built a base, possibly at a site now known as Elant's Ox Meadows, where archaeological evidence supports a Norse presence. They overwintered, explored, hunted, gathered. They built turf houses like those back in Greenland and Iceland. They slaughtered animals and dried meat. They gathered wood, precious wood. And then they left. Vinland was a land of promise, but also of danger. The sagas describe encounters with the indigenous peoples, whom they called Skraelings. These interactions ranged from trade to outright conflict. The Norse were never many, a few dozen at most, attempting to carve out a northern colony at the very edge of what was, to them, the known world. But while they may have seen themselves as adventurers, they were also just cold, hungry settlers. They wanted to build a place like home, a place where sheep could graze and families could grow. Instead, what they found was difficulty. Supplies ran low, internal disputes brewed, hostilities with locals escalated. The colony, if we can even call it that, was abandoned within a few years. The archaeology of absence. At Elance Ox Meadows, we find the quietest kinds of ruins. Not soaring walls or grand cathedrals, but turf outlines of longhouses, a forge, iron nails, a spindle whorl, things of everyday life. It is the ordinary that survives best. It tells you who was there not in songs, but in soot and soil. Even more interesting is what we don't find. There is no evidence of mass death or destruction, no final dramatic end, just a disappearance, a fading away. The Norse were there and then they weren't. They left almost nothing behind, and history moved on without noticing for nearly 1,000 years. It was only in the 1960s that the site was rediscovered, after decades of scholarly debate and amateur speculation. It offered proof that sagas weren't just legends, they held kernels of truth. But even then, the proof was sparse. A few structures, some tools, not enough to prove an enduring colony, but more than enough to prove presence. So why did they go? What made Leif Erikson or others like him sail west into the unknown? Was it heroism, necessity? The sagas speak of curiosity, of trade, of exile and adventure, but perhaps it was something simpler. Timber. Greenland had no trees. Iceland's forests had been stripped bare. A shipbuilder without timber is just a farmer with dreams. Could the first transatlantic contact have been motivated not by conquest, but by the humble need for wood? It seems so, which is perhaps the most quietly human motive of all. The Norse didn't discover America. They landed there briefly and then turned back. Their story, quiet, cold, and forgotten, challenges the usual ideas of what exploration means. But they were there, and they left traces in the wind and soil. And yet, even now, one wonders, what would have happened if they had stayed? You've returned to Vinland, or perhaps you never left. You're lying near a small turf house, its walls low to the ground, its roof covered in sod. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of dried fish, wood smoke, and boiled seal fat. Outside, the wind moves quietly through pine trees, trees rare and valuable to the people who built this house. We are not imagining an empire or a kingdom in waiting. What we are picturing is more modest, a seasonal camp, a tentative settlement, something temporary, something experimental. But even a small encampment says something remarkable. It means someone crossed an ocean and decided to stay for a while. Let's begin to understand why they didn't stay longer. The reality of settlement. Vinland was not settled by warriors. There may have been a few battle axes among the group, but there were also women, children, and tools for farming, spinning, and metalworking. The archaeological evidence from Elance Ox Meadows shows signs of domestic life. Fragments of bone needles, soapstone from Greenland, a spindle whorl made for spinning wool. This is crucial. A spindle means someone intended to produce textiles, likely woolen clothing, which is a long-term endeavor. It's slow, repetitive, and deeply boring, perfect for a sleep story, and indicative of serious settlement planning. You don't bring a spindle to a raid. And yet they didn't stay. Why? Let's consider what life might have actually been like for the Norse in Vinland. Climate and seasons. Not quite the paradise of saga. The sagas describe Vinland as warm and fruitful, a land of endless grass, salmon-filled rivers, and self-growing wheat. These descriptions are poetic, perhaps even exaggerated. Newfoundland is temperate by Arctic standards, but it is still cold, foggy, and difficult. The winters are long, and the growing season is short. While Leif and others might have landed during a favorable stretch, the reality of living through multiple years was much harder. Crops would have failed. Game might have disappeared. Preserving food for the winter, especially without easy access to salt, would have been difficult. and for Greenlanders used to a subsistence economy based on pastoralism, the soil in Newfoundland might not have yielded what they needed. Even the grass could have been unsuitable for their livestock. They may have dreamed of vineyards. What they found was a land of berries, bogs, and burdens. The Skrælings, neighbors or enemies. Another reality of life in Vinland was the presence of people who were already there. The sagas describe encounters with the Skrælings, likely ancestors of the Beothuk or Dorset peoples. At first, there was peaceful trade, red cloth exchanged for furs, milk for meat. But soon, tensions rose. The sagas describe violent arrows flying from canoes, Norsemen slain by ambush. From a Norse perspective, these were hostile natives. But from the perspective of the indigenous peoples, these were foreign intruders, who wouldn't respond with hostility to armed settlers building houses in your territory. Leif's brother Thorvald was killed in one of these encounters, according to the saga of the Greenlanders. He was struck by an arrow and asked to be buried on a headland overlooking the sea. It was named Crossing's Cape of the Cross. It's not a sweeping war, just a small skirmish, but it was enough. The Norse, never numerous, may have realized that they were outnumbered. There were no reinforcements, no fleet waiting back in Greenland. They had to manage on their own. And when you are only a few dozen people surrounded by an unfamiliar land and culture, the risk of staying can outweigh the promise. Isolation and distance. It's hard to overstate how isolated Vinland was. From Norway to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland, from Greenland to Vinland, it was a chain of settlements across thousands of miles of cold, stormy sea. The voyage from Greenland to Vinland alone was over 2,000 kilometers through waters filled with icebergs, whales, and unpredictable winds. Communication was slow and fragile. A ship might make it once a year, or it might not. Storms could delay it for months or sink it entirely. There was no supply chain, no steady influx of settlers, no postal system, no roads, and no secure trade routes. In fact, much of what we know about Vinland comes from oral sagas, written down 200 years later. That's how far removed these events were from even their own history. When you build a camp in Vinland, you're not building a town. You're building a question mark, a hope. Economics and the timber trade. Despite all of these hardships, the Norse kept returning for a while. Why? Timber. Greenland had little to no wood. Even driftwood was scarce. In Iceland, deforestation had been so extreme by the 11th century that laws were passed to protect what little remained. Vinland offered forests of spruce, fir, and birch, essential materials for ships, buildings, and tools. Timber was a reason to endure the voyage. And in a world where everything had to be constructed by hand, with wooden pegs, beams, and planks, a single good tree could be worth a great deal. Some scholars believe that Vinland was never intended as a permanent colony, but as a seasonal resource base, a place to harvest timber and fish, perhaps to trade furs. Like a medieval version of a logging camp or a whaling station. A camp, not a colony. Did anyone stay? Here is where the silence grows deeper. There is no clear record of a long-term Norse population in Vinland. Elant's Ox Meadows shows evidence of brief habitation, possibly just a few seasons. There are no cemeteries, no churches, no large-scale farms. But there are whispers. In 2021, archaeologists confirmed that Elant's Ox Meadows was occupied around the year 1021 CE, based on radiocarbon dating of a tree ring cut by metal tools. That's a very specific date. It anchors the sagas in scientific evidence. But what about after that? There are hints, rumors of other camps, of Hop and Stromfjord, places named in the sagas but never confirmed. Scholars have searched up and down the North American coast, from Nova Scotia to Massachusetts. No clear proof has emerged. And yet, what if there were other sites, now lost to erosion, overgrown, or built over? What if Norse settlers did stay a bit longer unnoticed, unrecorded, their dwellings reclaimed by forest? After all, the Norse were quiet colonists. They didn't build stone fortresses or plant flags. They built with turf and timber, materials that rot, collapse, and disappear. Could there be traces still hidden in the soil? Echoes in the sagas. The sagas themselves are ambiguous. They tell overlapping, sometimes contradictory stories. In the saga of the Greenlanders, we meet Leif, Thorvald, Karlsefni, Gudrid, and Freydis, each with their own voyage westward. Gudrid gives birth to a son, Snorri, said to be the first European born in America. But the records are unclear. Was he born in Vinland? Was he even real? The sagas also mention Thorfinn Karlsefni, who attempted a longer-term settlement with multiple families, cattle, and tools. But this, too, ends in retreat. The sagas rarely explain why, only that it became too dangerous, too difficult, too remote. And so slowly the journeys west ceased. What were they thinking as they left? Imagine being the last Norseman to stand on Vinland's shore. You've cut your timber, you've buried your dead. The fog rolls in over the bay. The sails are ready. You look back once more at the low turf houses, already beginning to slump into the earth. Did you know this was the end? Did you think someone else would return? Did you leave behind a carving, a runestone, a scrap of cloth? We may never know. But their silence echoes louder than their presence. And so we must ask, was Vinland a failure or simply forgotten? You're still in Vinland, but now the camp is empty. The turf walls are slowly collapsing. Moss spreads across the wooden beams. The forge is cold. Iron tools rust quietly beneath the soil. There is no fire in the hearth, no footsteps outside, no voices speaking Old Norse. The sea still crashes on the rocks. The trees still stand, tall and watchful, but the Norse are gone. This is the aftermath of a brief presence 3 to 10 years, perhaps, and then a retreat. Not in shame, not in flames, but in silence. Now we ask, why was this story forgotten? Why didn't it matter more to history? And what happened to the people who left? The return to Greenland. After Vinland, the settlers returned to Greenland. Life there remained hard. The settlements eastern and western clung to the edges of habitability. They depended on ivory trade, fishing, and increasingly rare connections to Europe. Vinland was not spoken of much. Perhaps it was too painful, a missed opportunity, or simply too irrelevant to daily life. Timber, berries, and brief exploration were not enough to outweigh the need for safety and sustainability. There are no records of further voyages after the early 11th century. Greenland's population stabilized at a few thousand. The Norse in America faded into memory, not even myth, just omission. But the story didn't end. It continued in echoes, in sagas, and eventually in archaeology. The sagas and their sleepy survival. For centuries, the sagas remained the only testimony of Norse presence in America. Written down in the 13th and 14th centuries in Iceland, they were not official records, but oral histories often contradictory, sometimes fantastical. The saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red are our main sources. In them, we read of exploration, family disputes, trade with Skraelings, and the short-lived hopes of new land. These stories sat quietly in monastic libraries. They were copied, recopied, read by scholars, and largely dismissed by the outside world. In an age of rising European empires and Renaissance exploration, few believed that medieval farmers had crossed the Atlantic 500 years earlier than Columbus. There were too many reasons to ignore it. No cities, no conquest, no lasting colonization. And so the sagas became legends, fascinating but unconfirmed, dull even, not filled with the grandeur that the age of discovery demanded. 1,000 years later, Elance Ox Meadows. Then, in the 1960s, Everything changed quietly like history often does. In northern Newfoundland, Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad, a husband and wife team of explorers and archaeologists, discovered the remains of Norse-style buildings. Turf walls, a smithy, iron nails, all matching the construction style of Greenland and Iceland in the early 11th century. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the age. Later research in 2021 even provided an exact year, 1021 CE, thanks to tree rings affected by a known solar storm. This was no fantasy. The Norse had been here, and they had left the faintest of footprints. This discovery confirmed what sagas had hinted at for centuries. Vinland was real. The Norse had made landfall in North America. They had worked metal, built houses, lived even if only briefly on this distant shore. But it was not a colony. It was never meant to be one. Why the Norse didn't colonize America? This is the question that lingers. Why didn't the Norse settle permanently in North America? They had the ships, they had the knowledge, they even had brief success. Several reasons emerge. 1. Numbers. The Norse population in Greenland was small. Iceland's was not much larger. There simply weren't enough people to spare for a permanent outpost thousands of kilometers away. 2. Logistics. Crossing the Atlantic was difficult. Ships could only sail in summer. Storms, icebergs, and unpredictable winds made every voyage dangerous. A supply line was impossible to maintain. 3. Hostility. Relations with the indigenous peoples were strained from the start. The Norse were not conquerors in this case. They lacked the numbers and organization for war. A few violent encounters were enough to discourage return. 4. Economics. The Norse were not driven by conquest or gold. They wanted timber, fish, and pasture. Once those needs were met or failed to be met, there was no compelling reason to risk further ventures. 5. Cultural priorities. Medieval Norse society valued self-sufficiency, tradition, and local governance. There was no monarch sponsoring a grand expedition, no church mandating mission, no empire to feed, just farmers, traders, and settlers. They explored, yes, but they did not expand. The great forgetting. Perhaps the strangest part of this story is how easily it was forgotten. Even after Eland's Ox Meadows, the Norse voyages did not dramatically alter our historical narrative. Schoolchildren still learn that Columbus discovered America. Few mention Leif Erikson, and fewer still Gudrid or Thorvald. The Norse didn't rewrite maps. They didn't redraw borders. They came, saw, stayed briefly, and left. History tends to reward those who build empires, not those who explore and retreat. But in forgetting them, we miss something important. We miss the idea that exploration can be quiet. That discovery doesn't always lead to domination. That sometimes contact between cultures is brief, tense, and ultimately unresolved. A thought for the present. As you lie here, listening to this ancient story, think of how fragile history is. How easily a house made of turf can vanish into the forest. How centuries of oral tradition can slip into myth. How few timbers buried in Newfoundland's soil rewrote everything we thought we knew. The Norse may not have colonized America, but they were here, and that presence, quiet, temporary, and almost lost, reminds us that history is full of unfinished stories. Not everything needs a climax. Not everything ends with a conquest or collapse. Sometimes history fades like footprints in snow. And so we ask, as the waves whisper on the shore, if history forgets you, were you ever truly here at all? Story 2. Grapes, Timber, and Cold. What the Vikings really found in America. You're on a coastline again. The tide rises and falls. The wind carries the smell of spruce and salt. This is the place they called Vinland, a name that has confused scholars, misled explorers, and inspired poets for centuries. Vinland, the land of wine, or vines, or maybe just pasture. The Norse were here, we know that now. But what exactly did they find? What made them return again and again, even briefly, despite danger and distance? The truth, like most of history, is not in a grand moment but in the small, persistent details. The grapes or berries, the timber and the cold. Let's look at the world not from the saga's lens of adventure, but from the viewpoint of ordinary survival. What did the Norse actually see when they arrived on this unfamiliar land? What resources did they measure? What plants did they taste, and what animals did they follow? This is a story of slow discovery, not instant conquest. Naming the land, a misunderstood legacy. The name Vinland appears in both major sagas, the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red. It's usually translated as land of wine or land of vines. That's how many people came to believe the Norse had discovered grapes, real, European-style wine grapes on the coast of North America. But here, where it gets complicated. True Vitis vinifera grapes, the kind used in winemaking, don't grow that far north. Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, even Maine have native grape species, but they aren't the same. They're smaller, more sour, more like berries than vineyard fruit. So what did they mean? Some scholars argue that vin in Old Norse could also mean pasture or meadow. Others suggest that Leif Erikson or his companions may have exaggerated, or that their descriptions were filtered through centuries of saga writing. But native wild grapes do grow in parts of eastern North America. The Vitis riparia, or riverbank grape, thrives in areas with warmer summers. It's possible the Norse landed during a particularly warm phase of the early 11th century and saw thick grapevines growing along rivers. To a Greenlander or Icelander people used to treeless landscapes and months of snow, this may have felt like the Garden of Eden. Even if the grapes weren't ideal for wine, they represented abundance, life, fertility. In a way, Vinland was never about wine. It was about hope. The trees, timber as treasure. Perhaps the most valuable thing in Vinland wasn't the fruit. It was the trees. This can't be overstated. In Iceland and Greenland, wood was scarce. Iceland's birch forests had been nearly wiped out by the 11th century due to settlement, farming, and shipbuilding. Greenland had almost no trees at all, only driftwood, which was prized and protected. When the Norse landed in North America and saw dense, old-growth forests, it was like stumbling into a vault of gold. Spruce for building longhouses, fir and pine for ships, birch bark for containers, hardwood for tools. Even firewood, something the Greenlanders had to ration carefully, was suddenly abundant. Some historians now believe that this was the primary reason for Norse interest in Vinland. Not conquest or farming, but resource extraction. Think of it like a medieval logging expedition. They didn't need to settle permanently. They just needed to harvest, ship, and return. This theory is supported by the temporary nature of Norse structures found at Elant's Ox Meadows, and by the specific tools recovered: iron nails, rivets, carpentry tools, and signs of metalworking. The forge wasn't for weapons. It was for fixing things, for building, for cutting wood. Timber was wealth. Timber was survival. Timber was why they came. The climate question: a warmer world. When Leif and his companions landed in North America around the year 1000, they may have benefited from a period of relatively mild climate in the North Atlantic, known as the medieval warm period. This warming trend, roughly from 950 to 1250 CE, allowed for slightly longer growing seasons and milder winters in some parts of the Northern Hemisphere. It wasn't tropical, of course, but it may have made Newfoundland or even parts of Nova Scotia seem surprisingly livable. Snow came later. Rivers didn't freeze as early. Grapevines and other plants stretched farther north than they do today. That's not to say it was easy, just easier than Greenland. The climate also influenced sailing conditions. Open water routes were more navigable. Sea ice receded earlier in spring. Voyages that might have been impossible a century earlier became possible, if still dangerous. But climate, like everything, changes, and a few decades of warmth is not enough to build a civilization on. The wildlife, a land of resources. The sagas tell us that Vinland was rich in animals. They mention salmon in streams larger than any seen before, game animals in the woods, birds, eggs, and fish in abundance. These resources were crucial, not luxuries, but essentials for surviving the long months when sea voyages were impossible. Wildlife would have fed both the people and their animals. Cod and salmon could be dried or smoked for winter use. Birds could be hunted and their feathers used for bedding and clothing. And again, to a Norse settler from Greenland, where hunting was often the only source of meat, this was paradise. But abundance doesn't mean sustainability. They likely hunted in ways familiar to them, setting snares, using dogs, fishing with nets. But local ecosystems and animal behaviors were different, and the Norse, for all their skill, were not trained for this land. A bad hunting season could be fatal. Without reliable farming, it was survival by luck and weather. The agricultural temptation and failure. Did the Norse try to farm in Vinland? Maybe. They certainly brought tools, and some accounts mention attempts at grain cultivation or animal husbandry. But the soil in Newfoundland is acidic and stony. The climate shortens the growing season. Clearing forest for fields would have taken years' time they didn't have. And then there were the locals. Imagine planting barley, only to discover your settlement is under threat. Hostile relations with indigenous peoples would have made large-scale agriculture almost impossible. There are no signs of fences, fields, or barns at known Norse sites. No plows, no large storage pits. Farming may have been attempted, but it likely failed or never really began. This reinforces the theory that Vinland was not a colony, but an outpost. A seasonal camp, a resource station. A place to gather, not to grow. What they found: grapes, timber, and cold. In the end, the Norse found three things in America. Grapes or berries that symbolized a land of abundance, though perhaps more symbolic than practical. Forests that offered a lifeline of timber, critical to maintaining their way of life back home. Cold, danger, isolation, and ultimately, a reason not to return. Their brief time in Vinland was a study in contrasts, rich in resources but poor in prospects. Tempting, yet terrifying. Full of promise, but only if you ignored the risks. What they really found was that America in their time was just too big, too wild, and too far. Not a new home, just a distant shore. A question remains. They saw the grapes, they cut the trees, and they felt the cold in their bones. They returned with stories of a rich and distant land. And then the silence. There were no more ships, no more camps, no more settlers. So we must ask again, what if the Norse had returned not just for timber but to stay? What kind of America might have grown from log houses and turf walls? You are still with the Norse, still in Vinland. The light is thin and gray. It is early morning. A soft fog clings to the pine trees. Somewhere in the forest a bird calls. In the half-dark, a figure stokes a small fire outside a turf-walled shelter. The fire crackles. A pot of water is heating. Inside, a small group of people are waking slowly to another day of life at the edge of the known world. This isn't the stuff of saga or song. It's the dull rhythm of survival. They are far from Greenland, farther still from Norway or Iceland. There is no help, no guarantee of return, just wood, berries, fish, and each other. This is what the Norse found in America, the burden of living in a place not meant for them. So how did they do it? This section explores what day-to-day life may have looked like for Norse settlers in Vinland, those short-lived, seasonal camps on the American coast. It's the story of their food, their clothing, their shelters, their habits, and their hopes, all based not on fantasy, but on what archaeology, history, and careful inference suggest. Shelter, turf, timber, and efficiency. When the Norse built in Vinland, they did not reinvent architecture. They used what they knew: turf-walled longhouses and wooden halls. At Elance Ox Meadows, the remains of several structures match the layout and style of homes from Greenland and Iceland. Thick turf walls provided insulation. Timber frames supported roofs. Sod covered everything. These houses were dark inside. Windows were small or absent. Fire was the main light source. The smoke from the central hearth rose slowly through a vent, often lingering and coating the beams in soot. The floors were usually packed earth. Benches lined the sides of the room, sleeping platforms by night, seats by day. Furs and woven blankets offered warmth. Every inch of space was used. In the smaller buildings, we find evidence of workshops. One had a forge, unusual and very important. It suggests that they were repairing tools or weapons on site. Another may have been used for spinning or weaving. Still others may have stored food or firewood. These were not castles. They were rough, practical structures, designed to keep people alive, not to impress. Food: boiled, dried, preserved. Eating in Vinland was a mix of improvisation and familiar methods. The Norse were already skilled in food preservation. In Greenland, they smoked and dried fish and meat. They stored butter in bogs. They made hard, dry bread called flatbrod and porridge from barley when they had it. In Vinland, they likely used similar techniques. From the sagas and the archaeology, we can assume they fished salmon and cod were both plentiful. They may have trapped birds or gathered eggs. They hunted deer or caribou. Seal and whale were less common than in Greenland, but possible. They would have boiled stews in soapstone pots, using what meat and herbs they could find. Berries could be eaten fresh, dried, or mixed into porridge. Honey, if discovered from wild bees, would have been a rare treat. Alcohol was probably scarce. Mead or beer would have required imported ingredients, grain or honey, which were not likely available in large amounts. And there was always the risk of hunger. A failed hunt, spoiled meat, too little wood to cook, too much snow to gather berries. Food in Vinland was never guaranteed. It was work. Clothing, wool, fur, and layering. Norse settlers dressed practically. Most clothing was made of wool, spun and woven by hand, then layered for warmth. Inner tunics, outer tunics, cloaks, trousers or long dresses, leather shoes, fur hats and mittens. A spindle whorl discovered at Elance Ox Meadows confirms that spinning wool was taking place. That means they either brought sheep or brought wool with them. The former is possible, though unlikely in large numbers. Livestock transport by ship was difficult. Fur from local animals, fox, beaver, caribou, may have supplemented their wardrobe, but hunting for fur takes time and skill. In short, they brought what they could, and then they made do. Every tear in a tunic, every broken shoe was a problem. There were no shops. Everything had to be repaired by hand, using local materials. Even getting warm was a daily task. Tools and labor, iron as a lifeline. Perhaps the most telling find at Vinland was the blacksmith's workshop. To build a forge here so far from home was a statement of intent. It meant they weren't just visiting. They were working, building, planning to endure. The forge at Elance Ox Meadows was primitive but functional. It had a hearth, slag remains, and signs of iron working, likely from bog iron, which the Norse knew how to harvest. Iron was life. With it they could make and repair. Nails and rivets for buildings and boats. Axes and knives. Needles. Hooks for fishing. Weapons if needed. Carpenters, smiths, and weavers worked side by side. This was not an idle camp. It was a laboring outpost. But again, everything depended on weather, on tools not breaking, on supply ships returning, which often they didn't. Fear and uncertainty, a quiet anxiety. No matter how self-sufficient they tried to be, fear lingered. Fear of the unknown. This was a land without maps. Every forest path could lead to ambush or dead end. Fear of the locals. The Skraelings were not always hostile, but they were powerful, and their numbers were greater. Fear of winter. Would snow come early? Would food last? Fear of being forgotten. If a ship never returned, they would vanish. The Norse were used to hard conditions, but isolation at this scale was different. Even in Greenland, there were neighboring farms, familiar speech, shared law. In Vinland, they were alone. Language, landscape, even the stars above felt strange. This wasn't just physical hardship, it was emotional erosion. A community of few. Scholars estimate that the Norse presence in Vinland involved perhaps 60 to 100 people at most. They were likely chosen for specific skills: carpenters, sailors, blacksmiths, perhaps a healer or a storyteller. Some brought family, others came as hired workers. Their community was small, everyone had to contribute. There was no anonymity, no idleness. Each fire had to be tended, each wall repaired, each meal cooked by someone's tired hands. Conflicts could be dangerous. A single fight could fracture morale, illness could spread fast, an injury while chopping wood could be fatal. But in the quiet moments when meals were shared, songs sung, or a child laughed, the camp may have felt like a home, even if only for a season. The inescapable cold. For all the stories of grapes and green meadows, Vinland was cold. Not brutally Arctic, but cold enough to wear through boots, dampen spirits, and freeze rivers. In winter, the days were short. Fires had to be fed constantly. Snow piled high. They built shelters with insulation in mind. They layered clothes. They closed their homes tight at night. But cold still seeped in. And worse than the cold was the damp, a kind of creeping chill that never quite left, even with a fire burning. It got into your bones, your blankets, your food stores. This was not the paradise the sagas suggested. It was a challenge livable, barely. And it wore them down. Why stay? So why did they stay, even for a little while? Why did Karlsefni bring livestock? Why did Gudrid give birth to a child here, in this uncertain place? Because Vinland almost worked. It had wood. It had fish. It had shelter. It had promise. The Norse weren't foolish. They knew risk, but they were also resilient. They saw possibilities. And for a few years they tried to carve out something new, to live at the edge of a different continent, to bring order, craft, and survival to an alien shore. But in the end, it wasn't enough. A quiet departure. There are no stories of dramatic battles, no plagues or fires. The Norse didn't die en masse. They just left. They packed their tools, disassembled the forge, gathered the last of their supplies, boarded the ships, and sailed east back to Greenland, back to what was known. And as they disappeared over the horizon, the wind whistled through empty buildings. Trees grew taller, soil settled into the turf walls, the longhouse roof sagged. Vinland became silent again. But still we wonder, did they plan to return? Or did they know, even as the sails filled, that they were leaving Vinland behind forever? Vinland is behind you now. The ship creaks and sways. The sea is cold as always. Behind you lies the soft coastline, the rivers thick with salmon, the forests untouched and tall. You carry timber in the hold, a few tools, perhaps some berries dried for the journey, maybe even stories, but nothing more. The land they called Vinland did not hold the Norse, and now they are sailing home, not to a grand reception, not to royal courts, but to small turf houses perched on the cliffs of Greenland. This is not the story of empire. It is the story of what might have been, and what was quietly lost. A vanishing act. After perhaps a decade of seasonal attempts, the Norse abandoned Vinland entirely. The sagas give hints: conflict with natives, internal disputes, poor planning, but the archaeological record is silent on any definitive cause. The decision wasn't sudden. There's no evidence of disaster, no mass graves, no ruins of battles. They simply stopped going. The Vinland voyages were forgotten not just by Europe, but even by the Norse themselves. Back in Greenland and Iceland, life resumed as it always had, hard, cold, and slow. The memory of Vinland became less fact and more family tale, a place once reached, then left. Centuries later, when the sagas were finally written down, Vinland was a distant legend, half believed, barely mapped. A land that could have changed history, but didn't. Why didn't it matter more? History is often shaped not by what happened, but by what people believe happened. The Norse reached America, but they didn't build cities, they didn't start wars, they didn't trade spices or gold. There was no pope to bless the voyage, no king to declare ownership. Without those things, their journey faded. By contrast, when Columbus reached the Caribbean in 1492, his voyage was immediately absorbed into European politics, religion, and economy. It was documented, repeated, financed, and eventually weaponized. But Leif Erikson, Thorvald, Gudrid, they left no such mark. Even the sagas that mention them are tangled and contradictory. In some, Leif builds houses. In others, it's Karlsefni. In some, Freydis leads a massacre. In others, she doesn't even appear. And when Europe finally began mapping the world in earnest, the Norse stories seemed too hazy to matter. Lost in translation, the sagas versus the soil. For centuries, scholars debated whether Vinland was real at all. The sagas, despite their contradictions, always insisted on a western land lush, wild, and just beyond reach. But it wasn't until the 1960s that archaeology confirmed it. At Elance Ox Meadows, the turf walls were buried under centuries of moss and grass, but they were unmistakably Norse. Iron nails, a smithy, spindle whorls, even butternuts suggesting the Norse may have traveled south into regions where such trees grew. Still, the site was small, no more than a seasonal camp. It was not the lost Viking city some had hoped for. It was a whisper, not a shout. But it was proof. Why they did stay, a summary. After all we've explored, let's briefly summarize why the Norse never stayed in America. 1. Lack of critical mass. With only a few dozen settlers, they could never secure long-term survival. Disease, conflict, or just bad luck could wipe out a community. 2. Distance from home. The long journey over 2,000 kilometers from Greenland meant no stable supply chain, no reinforcements, no trade routes. 3. Hostile relations. The indigenous peoples of North America outnumbered and outmatched the Norse in local knowledge and often tactics. The Norse were isolated. 4. Limited immediate profit. There was no gold, no spices, no marketable luxury goods. Just timber, and Greenlanders already had access to walrus ivory, their main export. 5. Cultural priorities. There was no religious mandate to settle the New World, no crusade, no colonial vision, just farmers and traders trying to get by. They saw the land, they admired it, and they left it. What if they had stayed? Let's entertain the question one last time. What if the Norse had settled? What if they had established a permanent colony in Newfoundland or further south? Would European colonization have begun centuries earlier? Would the Americas speak a Norse-based language today? Would indigenous history have changed even more drastically? Maybe, but perhaps not. Even a small Norse colony would have struggled without support from Europe. The political infrastructure wasn't there. The religious or economic motivation wasn't there, and the population pressure simply wasn't great enough to push people into such a risky frontier. They may have lasted a generation, maybe two, But without ships, without trade, and without fresh settlers, even the best prepared outpost would wither. The Norse weren't defeated. They just didn't follow through. The legacy that was. Still, the fact remains. The Norse reached North America. They explored, they settled, they built, they ate and slept and worked. Then they left. For centuries, this story lay dormant. No monuments, no written record from the settlers themselves, no grand discoveries. Just turf, timber, and cold. And in many ways, that's the most remarkable part. Not that they failed, but that they did it at all without maps, without compasses, and without the promise of glory. They crossed an ocean in wooden ships, found a new continent and lived on it. For a while, a thought to drift on. As you rest now, think not of empire but of effort. Think of the quiet hands that built houses in a strange forest, of the weary eyes that watched the sea for returning sails, of the families who tried, for a few short seasons, to make a home where none had ever stood. Vinland was real, but it was not lasting. Still, the Norse made history not with war, but with presence. They didn't conquer the land, but they touched it and left just enough for us to remember. And maybe that's the real legacy, that history isn't always made by those who stay, but sometimes by those who dared to come at all. Story 3. Leif Erikson's Forgotten Voyage. Maps, Myths, and Mundanity. Close your eyes, you're back in the North Atlantic again. The water is cold, the sails flap. The creak of wood, the groan of rope, these are the only sounds. There is no applause, no cheering crew, just the work of sailing hour after hour, day after day. At the helm stands a man who, by all rights, shouldn't be remembered. He didn't conquer a nation. He didn't claim a continent. He didn't found an empire. And yet, Leif Erikson is one of the few names from the Viking age that endures. Why? This is the story of Leif, not the legendary explorer, but the quiet figure behind the myth. Not the bringer of Europe to America, but a man on a personal journey shaped by exile, family, trade, and circumstance. His voyage was real, but his role in history may have been more mundane and more human than most stories would like to admit. Let's start not with his discovery of Vinland, but with who he was. Leif, son of an outlaw. Leif was born around 970–980 CE, most likely in Iceland. His father was Eric the Red, a man exiled from both Norway and Iceland for multiple murders. Eric's response to exile was not to lay low, but to keep moving west. That's how Greenland was settled, by exiles. Families banned for blood feuds, land disputes, or petty violence. So from the beginning, Leif was part of a lineage defined by restlessness and rebellion. He grew up in Brattahlid, the eastern settlement of Greenland, one of the few habitable places in a deeply inhospitable land. The community scraped by with fishing, hunting, and limited farming. Trade with Iceland and Norway was seasonal and unreliable. Leif's world was one of scarcity. His father, Eric, was bold and often violent. His mother, Thornjodhild, was religious, eventually Christian. Leif would grow up caught between those influences. We know little about his childhood, but by the time he came of age, Leif was already sailing. Trade was a necessity in Greenland. Timber, grain, tools all had to be imported. Every able-bodied man learned the ways of the sea. It was not heroism, it was survival. The Norway voyage, where the saga begins. According to the sagas, Leif sailed east to Norway as a young man. There, he entered the service of King Olaf Tryggvason, a Christian ruler known for his zealous missionary work. It's here that Leif was baptized, converted to Christianity, and commissioned to spread the faith to Greenland. Not as a missionary priest, but as a nobleman with a duty to his homeland. This is where most retellings skip ahead to Vinland, but let's pause here. Why would a Greenlandic settler convert to Christianity? Perhaps it was practical. Aligning with Olaf gave Leif status. Perhaps it was political. Christian kings were gaining power. Perhaps he believed his mother would later build the first church in Greenland. Whatever the reason, Leif returned west not with dreams of exploration, but as a religious emissary. He carried priests, holy books, and perhaps a new worldview. Vinland wasn't even on the itinerary. The accidental discovery. The story goes that on his way back to Greenland, Leif was blown off course, a common occurrence in the unpredictable North Atlantic. Instead of Greenland, he saw new land, rocky coasts, forests, rivers, and wild growth. He landed, explored, named places, and eventually returned to tell the tale. This version paints Leif as a kind of accidental explorer, rather than a deliberate adventurer. And it might be true. The sagas say he heard about western lands from a trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had spotted distant shores years earlier but never landed. Leif supposedly bought Bjarni's ship and retraced the route. But that sequence, whether before or after his trip to Norway, is disputed. The sagas contradict themselves. One places Vinland before Leif's conversion, the other after. The authors, writing 2 centuries later, weren't concerned with strict timelines. All we know is this: Leif Erikson sailed west, reached new land, and returned safely. He didn't claim it, he didn't colonize it, he didn't write about it. He simply came back. The naming of lands. According to the sagas, Leif found and named 3 lands on his voyage. Helluland, land of flat stones, likely Baffin Island. Markland, forest land, likely Labrador. Vinland, land of vines, possibly Newfoundland or further south. These names suggest observation, not conquest. They named what they saw: stones, trees, grapes, or meadows. Unlike later explorers, Leif didn't name lands after kings, saints, or sponsors. His was a utilitarian kind of naming, simple, functional, descriptive. No fanfare, just facts. This is a theme that recurs in the Norse approach to exploration. It wasn't driven by imperial ambition or religious crusade. It was about resources: timber, pasture, maybe fish. Leif's report, when he returned, likely sounded less like a myth and more like, "There's wood, some berries. The climate's better than Greenland." Which to a Greenlander was big news. No saga of Leif. You might expect that a man credited with being the first European to land in North America would have songs written about him. A saga bearing his name. Tales of heroism and battle. But Leif Erikson does not have a dedicated saga. He appears as a character in the sagas of others: Eric the Red, the Greenlanders, Gudrid, Freydis. In them, he's calm, competent, but not central. That's telling. His fame came much later, in part because later generations needed a first. As Europe expanded across the Atlantic in the 15th and 16th centuries, the memory of the Norse grew more intriguing. And Leif, quiet, uncontroversial, and already Christian, was the perfect candidate to be elevated. In the 19th and 20th centuries, especially in America, he became a symbol, a Norse answer to Columbus. Statues went up, Leif Erikson Day was created, schoolchildren learned his name. But for most of history, he was a footnote. He made a voyage, he returned, and then he faded into the background. A question of motivation. Why did Leif sail west? Not the saga answer, but the real one. Because he had a ship. Because he heard rumors. Because timber was needed. Because trade demanded it. Because he could. In a world without clear maps or defined borders, sailing west wasn't necessarily more ambitious than sailing east. It was dangerous, yes, but it was part of Norse life. And for Leif, whose family had already migrated from Norway to Iceland to Greenland, movement was familiar. He didn't seek to rewrite history. He just set sail. A pause before legacy. So now we have a man, born to an outlaw, raised in a marginal land, converted to Christianity, blown off course, found new land, returned to tell the tale. No battles, no colonies, no cities, just presence. And for nearly 1,000 years, that's all there was. Until suddenly, centuries later, Leif became important again. So we must ask, what happens when history forgets someone and then remembers them for something they never claimed to be? You are still with Leif Erikson, but now the sails are furled. The voyage is complete. The coastline lies behind. The ship is moored. What remains is not the sea, but the memory of what he saw. And here's the strange part. Leif did not make a map. No chart survives, no written log, no carved stone, no sea scroll tucked into a longhouse trunk. In fact, the most remarkable thing about Leif's voyage might be what he didn't leave behind. This section is about silence, the absence of maps, reports, monuments, or treaties. We will explore what this absence tells us about how Norse exploration worked, why it left so little trace, and how later generations tried to recreate it from scraps of memory, myth, and muddled maps. Because sometimes, the most enduring legacy is a mystery. Mapping without maps. The Norse, unlike later European explorers, did not chart their voyages on paper. Instead, they used mental maps, a form of navigation passed down orally, through shared experience and memory. A shipmaster might know the direction of the coastlines, the feel of the current, the timing of bird migrations, the look of distant mountains. They used sunstone, calcite crystals to locate the sun on cloudy days. Land namabok, oral histories and land claim records passed through generations. Stars, wind, and wave patterns. Observations of seaweed, whales, and driftwood. This knowledge was highly practical, but not transferable. When Leif died, or even when a generation passed, his personal knowledge of Vinland likely died with him. No Norse map of North America exists, no detailed itinerary, no drawing in the margins of a monastery book. This was not neglect, it was a different kind of thinking. The Norse did not need permanent charts. Their world was local, oral, and lived. And so Vinland became a story, not a place. The sagas, mapping with memory. Centuries later, when Icelandic scribes began writing down the sagas, they relied on folk memory, oral tales that had drifted for generations. The saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red both include Leif's voyage, but with inconsistencies. In one, Leif discovers Vinland by accident. In the other, he seeks it deliberately. One says he names the places. The other suggests others do. Neither saga provides a clear route. They mention days of sailing, descriptions of terrain, animals, and climate, but no fixed coordinates, no repeatable directions. What they created was not a map, but a narrative geography. Places were understood by what happened there, not by where they were. Helluland was stony. Markland was forested. Vinland was fruitful. But how far apart were they? Which rivers ran where? No one knows. And this vagueness is why, for centuries, scholars debated whether Vinland was real or legend. The mythmaking of Leif. Leif himself appears briefly in the sagas. He is calm, observant, and often passive. He does not fight major battles. He does not argue with kings. He is remembered not for what he did, but for where he went. And that's part of why later generations embraced him. By the 19th century, Scandinavians, especially immigrants to America, began to celebrate Leif Erikson as a heroic discoverer. He was non-imperial, clean, and unburdened by the bloodshed of later colonization. In 1874, the U.S. honored him with a statue in Boston. In 1898, another was raised in Milwaukee. By 1964, Leif Erikson Day was officially recognized by the U.S. government. He became a symbol of quiet exploration, a pre-Columbian presence that offered cultural pride without conquest. But the truth is quieter still. Leif Erikson likely didn't know he was discovering anything. He wasn't rewriting history. He was navigating uncertainty, like so many others in the Norse world: fishermen, traders, settlers looking for resources, land, or a way home. Why didn't he return? This question lingers. Leif saw the land. He praised its bounty, so why didn't he go back? Was it political? Perhaps tensions in Greenland or Iceland kept him occupied. Was it personal? Family responsibilities may have taken precedence. Was it strategic? Maybe he concluded that Vinland was too risky. The sagas don't tell us, they move on. Leif fades into the background after his return. He does not die in battle. He is not exiled. He simply resumes life in Greenland, where he reportedly took over his father's estate and governed quietly. We hear no more of voyages, no mention of new expeditions, no tales of glory. Just silence. And that silence is one of the most historical things about him. The fragmentary legacy. So what are we left with? A few pages and 2 sagas. A camp at Elant's Ox Meadows. A name. A holiday. A statue or two. Leif Erikson's voyage is the least well-documented major transoceanic expedition in medieval history, and yet its implications are vast. It proves that Norse ships could cross the Atlantic centuries before Columbus. That contact between Europe and North America occurred, even briefly. That exploration does not require domination to matter. His is a story of non-colonial contact. No exploitation, no mass settlement, no resource extraction on a grand scale. And that makes it rare. Because most history we remember is loud, filled with conflict, conquest, or cultural upheaval. But Leif's voyage was quiet. A whisper across the ocean. The legacy of absence. In the end, Leif Erikson may be best remembered not for what he built, but for what he didn't. No cities. No flags. No empire. Just a journey, a few names, a memory that had to be recovered, not inherited. And so we're left with a strange truth. Sometimes the most enduring figures in history are the ones who left no monument at all. But we still have one more question to ask. If Leif hadn't returned, would anyone have known he was ever there? The ocean is still. You are drifting now, not across water but across time. Leif Erikson has returned to Greenland. His ship is moored, his sails furled, and his stories quietly folded into evening conversation around smoky hearth fires. There are no medals, no proclamations, only survival and perhaps the mild admiration of neighbors who believe him and those who do not. Vinland is behind him, but the real question is, did the world ever truly know he went? In this final section, we reflect on how Leif's voyage was remembered, if at all. Not in terms of glory, but in the slow erosion of fact into fable, and how the world nearly forgot that Europeans reached America 5 centuries before Columbus. Because perhaps the most extraordinary thing about Leif Erikson's journey is how ordinary history treated it. The fading of the Norse horizon. After Leif's voyage, other Norse explorers tried to follow. There was Thorvald Eriksson, Leif's brother, who led a small expedition and was killed by native inhabitants, reportedly shot with an arrow. There was Thorfinn Karlsefni, who attempted a more serious colonizing effort with families, livestock, and tools. It lasted longer, but not by much. Conflict, isolation, and tension with the indigenous peoples forced the group to abandon the settlement. There was Freydis, Leif's half-sister, whose violent actions in one version of the saga led to the deaths of several would-be settlers. Each of these figures had their own motivations, but none succeeded in making Vinland permanent. And so the North American coast became something of a ghost frontier known, reachable but unclaimed. The Norse knew it was there, they just chose not to return. And with each passing generation, memory dimmed. The collapse of contact. There are a few key reasons why contact with Vinland did not continue. 1. Greenland's decline. By the 14th century, the Norse settlements in Greenland were shrinking. The climate cooled, ushering in the Little Ice Age, and trade routes became unreliable. Soil degraded. Walrus ivory, their primary export, fell out of favor in Europe. By 1500, the Greenland Norse had vanished, likely from famine, isolation, and eventual cultural absorption or death. When Greenland collapsed, the bridge to North America broke. 2. No imperial infrastructure. Unlike later explorers, Leif had no empire behind him, no state church to fund missions, no market to absorb new resources. His voyage was a family endeavor, not a national one. 3. Oral history's fragility. Without maps, books, or widespread literacy, the Norse relied on oral tradition. It worked until it didn't. Wars, plagues, and generational forgetfulness led to discontinuity. By the time the sagas were written in the 13th and 14th centuries, the events of Vinland were already ancient memory. The reemergence of a forgotten voyage. For most of European history, Leif Eriksson's voyage was unknown. When Columbus reached the Caribbean in 1492, he believed he was the first to cross the Atlantic. So did Ferdinand and Isabella. So did the Pope. The Norse were not mentioned. But in Iceland and parts of Norway, the sagas survived, stored in monastic libraries, whispered by scholars, occasionally translated. In the 18th and 19th centuries, interest in Old Norse literature grew. Antiquarians, linguists, and historians began to see the Vinland passages as more than just myth. Could they be real? Archaeological evidence remained elusive until 1960, when Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad discovered the Norse site at Elance Ox Meadows in Newfoundland. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the site to be around 1000 CE, matching the sagas. Suddenly, Leif Erikson was no longer a legend. He was history. But here's the curious part. By then, Columbus had already been celebrated for 400 years. Statues, holidays, cities named in his honor. Leif, by contrast, had almost no footprint in modern imagination. He was first, but he was quiet, and history had moved on without him. Columbus versus Leif, a tale of timing. When Columbus sailed, he had royal backing, religious sanction, a developing printing press to spread news, a continent ready to expand. Leif had none of these. He sailed before the Crusades, before the Holy Roman Empire reached its peak, before universities, before the concept of discovery as we know it. He sailed in a medieval world that wasn't ready to do anything with America. So when people say Columbus discovered America, they're technically wrong but functionally right. Columbus's voyage changed history. Leif didn't. Not because it couldn't, but because it came too early. The statue that came late. The first major statue of Leif Erikson in the United States was erected in Boston in 1887 as part of a growing Nordic pride movement. Another followed in Milwaukee, then in Minneapolis, where Scandinavian immigrants, especially Norwegians, wanted to remind America that they had a hero, too. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed a proclamation naming October 9th Leif Erikson Day, commemorating the arrival of Norwegian immigrants in 1825 aboard the sloop Restoration. But even today, it remains a quiet observance overshadowed by Columbus Day, which occupies the same week. And perhaps that is fitting, because Leif was never meant to be a conqueror. He was a sailor, a settler, a man caught between myth and mundanity. And that's what makes him human. What we remember and what we do. History has a bias toward loudness. We remember the conquerors, the kings, the discoverers who changed maps and toppled cities. But what about the ones who did? What about the explorers who turned back? What about the voyagers who saw new lands and simply said, "Not yet"? Leif Erikson represents a different kind of legacy, one based not on glory, but on presence. He was there. He sailed across the Atlantic. He saw trees, rivers, grapes. He built a camp. He ate, slept, watched the stars. And then he left. No monuments, no maps, no claims. Just the memory, barely kept alive, of what it meant to arrive. A final reflection. As you drift towards sleep, think of Leif not as a legend but as a man. Think of his ship, creaking in the fog. Think of the coastline, strange and quiet. Think of the firelight inside a turf house. Think of the decision to leave and the silence that followed. Leif Erikson didn't discover America. He simply came here and then went home. And for centuries, that might have been enough. But now we remember. Not because he asked us to, but because the traces he left refused to disappear. Story 4. The Skraelings. First contact with North America's indigenous peoples. The shoreline is quiet. The waves rise and fall with steady rhythm. On one side, a Norseman steps onto the sand, boots damp, cloak clinging to his shoulders. On the other side, someone watches from the trees, silent, unseen. They are meeting for the first time. Neither knows the other's language. Neither fully grasps what the other wants. One is from the cold edge of Greenland. The other has lived in this land for generations. There is no great battle, not yet. There is only contact, subtle, uneasy, profound. This is the story of the Skraelings, the word used by the Norse to describe the indigenous peoples of North America, those they encountered in Vinland, Markland, and perhaps beyond. This story is not about war or conquest. It's about the first meetings, the quiet stares across distance, the confusion of cultures trying to understand each other. It's also about the Norse perspective, what they saw, misunderstood, feared, and what they never truly grasped. And it's a story told mostly from one side, because the Skraelings didn't write sagas. So we listen carefully, and we look for the gaps. Who were the Skraelings? The term Skraelings comes from Old Norse, likely derived from skra, meaning skin or hide, possibly referencing the indigenous people's clothing made of animal skins. It may also carry a negative connotation, such as barbarian or weakling, though scholars debate the exact meaning. To the Norse, Skraelings was a catch-all term. But in reality, the people they encountered were diverse. In Newfoundland and Labrador, they likely met the ancestors of the Beothuk, a semi-nomadic indigenous people who lived off fishing, hunting, and gathering. The Beothuk used red ochre to paint their skin and tools, a detail that may have unsettled the Norse. Further north, they may have encountered Dorset or Thule peoples, Paleo-Inuit cultures, adept at surviving in Arctic conditions. These groups were skilled hunters, using tools made of bone, ivory, and stone. In more southern lands, if the Norse sailed as far south as the Gulf of St. Lawrence, they might have met Mi'kmaq or Maliseet peoples, forest dwellers with rich trade networks and seasonal camps. But to the Norse, these distinctions were invisible. They were simply the others, the unfamiliar. And in the sagas they became one, Skraelings. The first encounters, trade or tension. In the saga of the Greenlanders, the first meeting is surprisingly peaceful. The Norse approach a group of Skraelings with caution. There is curiosity. Gestures are exchanged. Goods are laid on the ground. The Norse offer red cloth, a color associated with wealth and status. In return, the Skraelings offer animal pelts, soft, well-prepared furs, which the Norse valued highly. There is no shared language, only signs, body language, and silent observation. The encounter ends well, trade is successful, no one is hurt. This moment, often forgotten, is significant. It shows that contact wasn't instantly violent. It was transactional, experimental, and potentially beneficial to both sides. But peace was fragile. The second encounter does not end as well. Misunderstanding and conflict. In later saga passages, tension escalates. According to the saga of Eric the Red, a Norse bull unfamiliar to the Skraelings breaks loose and charges toward them, bellowing. Startled and likely interpreting this as a threat, the Skraelings flee. The Norse misunderstand the reaction. They don't see the fear, they see a retreat. The Skraelings return later, not to trade but to attack. This moment reveals the dangers of cultural misreading. The Norse saw livestock as essential. The Skraelings saw a massive, horned creature charging at them. The Norse saw themselves as settlers. The Skraelings saw them as unpredictable intruders. Small actions had large consequences. The sagas describe arrows flying, Norsemen being killed, boats being launched in retreat. From trade to violence in a matter of days. Norse perspective, fear and fascination. The Norse accounts of the Skraelings are filtered through fear, confusion, and limited understanding. They describe people who moved quietly through the forests, weapons like slings, bows, and clubs, clothing made of skins and bone ornaments, an ability to disappear into the landscape. To a Norse settler who relied on visibility and open structures, this behavior seemed alien. The sagas reflect this. Skraelings are portrayed as both inferior and dangerous, primitive, yet capable of inflicting serious harm, not enemies of war but unpredictable forces of nature. But again, these are one-sided accounts. What did the Skraelings think of the Norse? We don't know. They had no iron. Suddenly, men in cloaks with steel axes and wool clothing appeared on their shores. They brought fire, animals, unfamiliar tools, and no warning. Imagine how strange that must have seemed. Even trade, even peace, must have felt precarious. The language barrier. No record exists of what language was spoken in these encounters. There is no Norse glossary of Skraeling terms, no preserved conversations, no effort to document. All we know is that gestures were used, and some trade terms may have been learned, like the word for sword, cloth, or yes. But without language, misunderstandings flourished. The Norse may have seen a nod as agreement. The Skraelings may have seen it as threat. Words could have soothed, but none were shared. This made sustained contact impossible. The Skraelings' world. From what we know through archaeology and oral history, the indigenous peoples of northeastern North America were well adapted to their environment. They moved seasonally, following animal migrations and fish runs. They lived in wigwams, tents, and semi-permanent camps. They used canoes to travel rivers and coastlines. They had spiritual systems, traditions, and extensive knowledge of the land. And they had their own networks of trade, alliance, and conflict long before the Norse arrived. To them, the Norse were new but not necessarily incomprehensible. Just another group to be evaluated. Are they useful, dangerous, worth knowing? The answer, it seems, became clear. A tipping point. In both major sagas, the final encounters with the Skraelings end in violence. In the saga of the Greenlanders, Thorvald Eriksson is killed by an arrow. His burial is described simply. No vengeance is taken. The settlers retreat. In the saga of Eric the Red, Karlsefni decides that the risk is too great. The indigenous peoples are too numerous. The Norse are too isolated. They pack their things, they leave. Not in defeat, but in acknowledgement. They were not welcome, and they could not survive without harmony. A question echoes. This story is not about the usual markers of history. No treaties, no colonization, no alliances. Just encounter, fear, and departure. And so we ask, what did the Skraelings tell their children about the pale people who came from the sea? The forest is dense. The smell of pine, damp earth, and smoke lingers. Somewhere nearby, something moves but slowly, quietly, like it belongs. A Norseman crouches near the tree line, watching, listening. He does not understand the language of the woods. And that is the core of the story. In this section, we step deeper into the experience of first contact from the Norse point of view, not as warriors or conquerors, but as farmers and traders suddenly faced with an indigenous culture vastly different from their own. The encounters with the Skraelings were brief and tense, but they left a mark on the Norse memory. And in that memory, we see the emotional texture of confusion, respect, fear, and awe. They came in canoes. To the Norse, ships were planks, rivets, iron nails, and square sails, heavy and loud. The Skraelings came in canoes, lightweight vessels carved from single trees or constructed from animal hides stretched over wooden frames. Silent, quick, and astonishingly maneuverable. The sagas describe these boats appearing suddenly, often from unexpected angles, river mouths, behind islands, or out of thick fog. They could arrive before the Norse even saw them. This was disorienting. In the Norse world, arrival was loud. Ships announced themselves with creaking hulls and dragon-headed prows. Here, people seemed to appear and disappear like forest spirits. This alone unsettled the settlers. To the Norse mind, trained in open spaces and long horizons, the Skraelings seemed invisible until they were close, and that was terrifying. Weapons of wood and stone. The Skraelings' weapons were unlike anything the Norse knew. Bows and arrows with bone or flint tips. Slings that hurled stones silently but with force. Clubs and spears, some decorated, some practical. The Norse had iron swords, axes, and shields, heavy, brutal tools of war forged in forges like the one at Elant's Ox Meadows. But they learned quickly, an arrow could still kill. One arrow, quiet, sudden, struck Thorvald Eriksson in the side. He died shortly after, reportedly calm, asking to be buried on a nearby headland with a cross at the site. This incident was personal. It wasn't part of a war. It wasn't a mass assault. It was a small group encountering another small group, and one moment of fear or hostility changed the course of everything. To the Norse, the Skraelings became dangerous not because they were powerful in the conventional sense, but because they were unreadable. They struck and vanished. They were not looking for battle lines. They were looking for boundaries. And the Norse didn't understand those boundaries. Food and fire. In a land unfamiliar to them, the Norse tried to live as they had in Greenland and Iceland, gathering berries, fishing, preserving meat. But everything was slightly different. The fish were of unfamiliar species. The berries didn't match the ones in saga or song. The animals behaved differently. Even the wind smelled different. Meanwhile, the Skraelings moved with confidence, knowing where the rivers split, which birds signaled danger, where to gather shellfish. They had survival patterns the Norse lacked. According to saga hints, there may have been exchanges of food. The Norse traded milk and cloth. The Skraelings gave furs and meat. These moments were rare but real. What the Norse may not have realized was that food was political. To the Skraelings, sharing food might mean peace. To the Norse, it was simple barter. When one group viewed the act as a treaty and the other as a transaction, conflict was inevitable. Strange beliefs, strange bodies. The Norse described the Skraelings' appearance in vague, often generalized terms. They noted red paint or ochre on skin and tools, clothing made from animal hides, hair that was dark and straight, no armor, no iron tools. This contrast reinforced the Norse perception of cultural distance, but it's important to remember, Norsemen themselves would have seemed alien to the Skraelings. Hair that was often blonde or red, woolen garments with bright dyes, axes and swords of gleaming iron, tall frames, possibly larger than locals, loud voices, laughter, prayer. We don't have the Skraeling's description of the Norse, but it's likely that they too were disturbed, amused, or curious. The idea of a bull brought on one of the expeditions was so strange to the Skraelings that it triggered panic. Large mammals were not part of their world. A roaring, horned creature must have felt supernatural. But without language, such things could not be explained. What was myth? What was animal? What was enemy? No one could say. An uneasy curiosity. There is a passage in the saga of the Greenlanders where a Skraeling picks up an iron axe and refuses to trade it back. It's a brief but telling detail. Iron was unknown to the indigenous peoples of this region. To them, it was not just valuable, it was possibly magical. Sharp beyond stone, resistant to breakage, strange in its heft. Imagine being handed a tool that could split wood in one swing, hold an edge for years, and seem to come from nowhere. The Skraeling's refusal to return it was not theft, it may have been a cultural moment of awe, a possession that now meant status, power, or change. But to the Norse, it was just a trade gone wrong. Again, misunderstanding, quiet, irreversible. A clash of worldviews. The Norse saw Vinland as empty, wild, untouched. The Skraelings saw it as home. This is perhaps the greatest gulf between them. To the Norse, land without fences or roads or churches felt unclaimed. To the Skraelings, ownership was based on use, tradition, and shared memory. A river bend, a hunting ground, a berry grove, all were known and respected. The Norse didn't intend to conquer, but they did settle, build houses, cut down trees, dig into the earth. To the Skraelings, this likely felt like intrusion, even desecration. And there was no court, no council, no place to negotiate such differences. There was only withdrawal or conflict. The camp becomes a target. Eventually, the Norse outpost, likely the one at Elant's Ox Meadows, became untenable. The Skraelings, whether out of caution or anger, began attacking. Small raids, arrows in the night, harassment. The Norse fought back, but numbers were not on their side. They realized that survival in Vinland meant either military dominance, which they could not maintain, or peaceful coexistence, which they could not secure. So they made a choice. They left. The forests swallowed their paths. Their turf houses collapsed. Their iron tools rusted beneath the soil. The Skraelings remained. A stillness after the storm. We often imagine first contact as explosive, a clash of armies, a moment of conquest. But here it was slower, sadder, more uncertain. Two small groups, neither fully understanding the other, collided. One left, one stayed. And no one sang about it. But still we ask, if the Norse had learned to speak the Skraelings' language, would history have turned out differently? The longships are gone. Their dragon-headed prows fade into the sea mist. The beach is quiet again. A small camp once filled with strange voices and iron tools now sits abandoned. The wind sighs through the forest. The trees, older than memory, remain untouched. But the people do not vanish. This is not the end of the story. Because while the Norse came and left, the Skraelings, the indigenous peoples of North America, stayed. They continued their traditions, hunted the same rivers, traveled the same coastlines. They remembered what they saw, and though we may never have their words written on paper, their presence lingers in landscape, artifact, and oral tradition. This final section reflects not on what was lost, but on what endured. It asks, how did this brief encounter shape both sides? What legacy did it leave behind? And how do we honor a contact that left almost no trace? We conclude the story not with conquest, but with continuity. The indigenous world after the Norse. To the peoples of the Northeast, whether Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, or Paleo-Inuit, the Norse were just one of many groups encountered over generations. Others came before them, other tribes, other travelers, and others came after Basque whalers, French missionaries, British traders. But the Norse were perhaps the first from across the ocean, a strange interruption in the long rhythm of seasonal movement and local life. And while the encounter was brief, its memory may have echoed in oral traditions. Some indigenous legends speak of pale-skinned men who came in floating houses, stories of tall strangers with shining tools, conflicts with men who came from the sea. These may refer to the Norse or they may not. Oral history doesn't pin itself to dates, but it remembers impact. And the Norse, with their metal, animals, and strange customs, were an impact. The Beothuk, a vanished people. One of the groups the Norse may have met was the Beothuk of Newfoundland. Centuries later, when European settlers arrived, the Beothuk were still present, living in small, semi-nomadic bands, painting themselves and their belongings in red ochre. They avoided contact, preferring isolation. Over time, they were pushed inland, away from the coasts, cut off from fishing grounds, cut off from trade. By the early 1800s, the last known Beothuk Shanadithit died in 1829. The people had disappeared, but their story, part of it at least, had been recorded, not by their own hand but by the outsiders who studied them. We will never know if the Beothuk carried stories of the Norse, but the cultural memory of strangers from the sea that may have lived longer than the bodies did. Indigenous knowledge of iron. One of the great questions is whether contact with the Norse changed indigenous technology. Did the Skraelings adopt iron tools? Did they salvage Norse artifacts? Did they adapt or reforge abandoned items? Archaeological evidence is slim, but there are signs that iron from Norse sources may have entered indigenous trade networks. A few items, iron knives, fragments of chain mail, rivets, have been found far from the Norse camp. Could this suggest barter, trade, or scavenging? Perhaps, but if so, the influence was small and short-lived. Indigenous groups retained their own tool-making traditions. They used bone, antler, stone, and copper, shaped with remarkable skill. They did not suddenly become metal cultures. This reminds us, the Skraelings were not waiting to be changed. They already had what they needed. A different kind of victory. We often think of history in terms of who conquered, but what if we thought instead of who endured? The Norse came to North America and they left. The Skraelings stayed. They survived centuries of change, adaptation, and eventual colonization. And while their encounter with the Norse left few scars, it also left few gains. No trade route, no alliance, no shared culture. But perhaps that too was intentional. Maybe the Skraelings saw that these newcomers, strange and armed, were not meant to be trusted. Or perhaps they simply knew that their way of life didn't need to include outsiders. And in that they were wise. What the Norse never understood. The sagas reflect Norse confusion. They did not understand the Skraelings' tactics, their sudden attacks, their withdrawals, their refusal to accept trade terms or settlement boundaries. But the truth is, the Skraelings understood something the Norse didn't. They were being tested. The Norse had come into a populated, known land thinking it was wild, empty, and ready for use. But the Skraelings had maps in their minds, histories in their steppes, and relationships with every hill and river. They were not invisible, they were watching. And when they decided the Norse were a threat, they pushed them back not with open war, but with constant pressure, refusal, and quiet resistance. That is its own kind of power. The final legacy. Today, no one speaks the language of the Skraelings the Norse met. No descendants bear their names. No texts preserve their voice. But they are not forgotten. They are remembered in the red-painted artifacts in Newfoundland museums, the quiet burial mounds in forest clearings, the old stories told by Mi'kmaq and in new elders, the mysterious figures in the sagas who came and vanished. And most of all, they are remembered in the silence the Norse left behind, a silence filled not with conquest, but with withdrawal. A thought to sleep on. As the Norse ships disappear over the horizon, the Skraelings turn back into the forest. No treaty was signed, no battle won. Just one people who came and left, and one who chose to remain. So tonight we ask, what stories do the land and sea remember long after the last words have faded from the sagas? Story 5, Gudrid the Far-Traveled, a Norse woman's life in the New World. It is quiet now. A longhouse settles into the ground. The firelight flickers against earthen walls. Somewhere in the dark, a woman is awake. She is not a warrior, not a queen, not a ruler or explorer in the way men were remembered. Her name is Gudrid Thorbjarnardatir, and she was one of the most widely traveled women of the Viking Age. She lived in Iceland, Greenland, North America, and eventually Rome. Her name survives in the sagas not as a conqueror or fighter, but as a woman who simply moved forward, no matter where life took her. This is her story. It begins not in battle, but in movement. A child of Iceland, Gudrid was born around the year 980 in Laugarbrekka, a small coastal farm on the Snæfellsnes Peninsula in western Iceland. Her father, Thorbjorn of Laugarbrekka, was a chieftain of modest wealth, respected but not powerful. The sagas describe her early life briefly. She was known for her beauty, her intelligence, and perhaps most importantly, her curiosity. She listened. She asked questions. She was, in the Norse sense, furtherfolk, a person inclined to travel. Even in her youth, Gudrid showed signs of spiritual restlessness. Raised in the last generation before Iceland's official conversion to Christianity, she would grow up straddling two belief systems, the fading old gods and the rising Church of Christ. This duality between old and new, between home and the world, would shape her entire life. Leaving Iceland, Greenland's hard promise. When Gudrid was still a young woman, her father Thorbjorn decided to leave Iceland. Whether driven by ambition, exile, or a sense of opportunity, he set sail for Greenland, which had recently been settled by Eric the Red. They sailed with others, friends, retainers, and kin across the cold Atlantic. The journey was long and, according to the sagas, disastrous. Several members of the party died of illness during the voyage. The crossing, already dangerous, became a floating wake. They arrived in Greenland not as settlers, but as survivors. It was a sobering start to Gudrid's adult life. But she stayed, she adapted. She worked, helped bury the dead, and built a new life in a harsh land. In Greenland, she first married a man named Thorir, who died not long after. Widowhood, even in her 20s, became her companion. But this did not stop her. Gudrid remained in Eric the Red settlement, now a key location in Greenland's struggling community. There she remarried. Her second husband was Thorstein Eriksson, son of Eric the Red and brother of Leif Eriksson. It would not be a peaceful marriage. A voyage for the dead. Thorstein was driven by grief and duty. His brother Thorvald had died in Vinland, struck by an arrow during one of the earliest Norse explorations of North America. Thorstein wished to sail west to retrieve his brother's body, not for glory, but for burial. In Norse tradition, honoring the dead mattered deeply. To leave a body unburied in a foreign land was a spiritual failure. And so Gudrid, now Thorstein's wife, joined him on a ship bound for the distant, barely known coast of Vinland. They never arrived. Storms pushed the ship off course. They spent the winter at a small, isolated farm in the western settlement of Greenland. There, disease broke out. Several people died, including Thorstein. Once again, Gudrid became a widow. But the saga pauses here for something remarkable. The vision. As Thorstein lay dying, Gudrid stayed by his side. In the saga, he speaks to her after death, a vision, a dream, or perhaps a poetic invention. He tells her to remarry, to go on, that she will have a long life, that she will travel to far places, that she will go to Rome. At the time, it must have seemed ridiculous. She was a twice-widowed woman in the Arctic wilderness. She had no ship, no husband, no wealth. But Thorstein's words would prove prophetic. The woman born in Iceland would not only set foot in Vinland, she would cross the known world. A third marriage, a new expedition. Sometime after Thorstein's death, Gudrid remarried, this time to Thorfinn Karlsefni, a trader of Icelandic origin, well-respected and relatively wealthy. And here, for the first time, Gudrid becomes a mother. But not in Greenland. Thorfinn proposed something bold, to establish a permanent settlement in Vinland. Not just a camp or expedition, but a real colony with families, livestock, farming, and trade. Gudrid agreed to go. This was not an easy decision. She had already survived a failed voyage to the same destination. She had buried one husband on a journey, but she still went. She boarded a ship once again, now pregnant, sailing west across a sea that had already taken so much. What kind of strength does that take? Not the strength of sword or shield, but the quiet kind, the strength of survival, of persistence. A woman in the New World. When the settlers arrived in Vinland, probably at or near Elant's ox meadows, they built turf houses and a central hall. They fished, hunted, and gathered. They explored inland and along the coast. And there, in this distant, cold corner of the world, Gudrid gave birth. Her son, Snorri Thorfinnsson, is believed to be the first child of European descent born in the Americas, nearly 500 years before Columbus. It was a birth not marked by celebration or royal record, just the cry of a baby, muffled by the thick turf walls of a Norse hall. But it was history. Still, life in Vinland was hard. Skirmishes with the Skrælings occurred. Food was uncertain. Tensions rose. After a few years, the colony was abandoned. The settlers returned to Greenland and from there to Iceland. But Gudrid had now lived on 3 continents, and she was not finished yet. A question begins. As she sailed home, now with her son and husband, Gudrid must have looked back on the coast of Vinland and wondered, was that the end of her journey or only the middle? She had crossed the Atlantic twice, buried 2 husbands, lived through plague, starvation, and childbirth in a foreign land. But something else was stirring. Something quieter, more spiritual. Something that would eventually take her to Rome. But before we follow her there, we must ask, what drives a woman born on a farm in Iceland to walk all the way to the heart of Christendom? The Atlantic is behind her now. The cold edge of Greenland, the fog-wrapped coast of Vinland, the drifting ice fields and uncertain settlements all gone. Gudrid is home in Iceland. But she is not the same woman who left. She has crossed oceans, buried husbands, born a child in a land without a name, and now, for the first time, her feet rest on the same ground where she was born, but her heart, it seems, has begun to travel elsewhere. This section tells the second half of Gudrid's journey not in longships or on rugged trails, but in belief, reflection, and faith. It is the quietest part of her life, and perhaps the most significant. A return to Iceland. After the failed Vinland colony, Gudrid returned to Iceland with her husband, Thorfinn Karlsefni, and their son Snorri. They settled at Glomber in northern Iceland, a fertile valley known for its farmland and good grazing. Here, the sagas describe a more conventional life, raising livestock, tending fields, and raising children. But even this life was extraordinary. At Glomber, Gudrid was not just a mother. She was a hostess, a healer, a woman known for her knowledge of herbs, her sense of diplomacy, and her ability to manage a household that included servants, freedmen, and kin. She was also a Christian, at a time when Iceland was still negotiating its religious identity. Christianity had been officially adopted in Iceland around 1000 CE, but in practice, old and new beliefs coexisted. Farmers still offered to the land spirits. Carvings of Thor hung beside crucifixes. Churches were built, but not always attended. Gudrid's home had a church, possibly the first at Glomber. This detail matters, because soon her journey would turn inward. Widowhood again. Thorfinn Karlsefni died sometime after their return. There is no dramatic saga about his death, no battle, no shipwreck, just the passing of a man who had once dreamed of founding a new land. Gudrid once again was a widow. Now she was also the matriarch of her household, mother to Snorri, and guardian of the family's legacy. But she was not content to remain at Glomber forever. Something else called to her. According to the saga of Eric the Red, Gudrid decided late in life to undertake a pilgrimage to Rome. It is one of the most remarkable claims in all the sagas. A Norse woman born in Iceland travels to the center of the Christian world. Not as a diplomat, not as an envoy, just as herself. To Rome on foot. We do not have detailed records of her journey. The sagas, as always, are sparse. But from what we know of medieval pilgrimage routes, the journey from Iceland to Rome would have involved a ship to Norway, overland travel through Denmark or Germany, south through the Alps, eventually arriving in Rome, perhaps through the Via Francigena, the ancient pilgrim path. It would have taken months, possibly over a year. She would have walked much of the way. There were no inns, only monasteries and churches offering shelter to travelers. She would have carried letters of introduction, or perhaps none at all. She would have prayed, observed, and listened. And somewhere along the way, she would have stood quietly, among strangers at the heart of a world vastly different from the fjords and fields of Iceland. Rome, the end of the earth. To a Norse woman, Rome was less a place than a myth. It was the seat of the Pope, the heart of the Latin Church, a city of saints and bones and basilicas. For someone raised among turf houses and oral sagas, Rome must have seemed impossibly vast. There is no record of her reception, no audience with the Pope, no official act. But that perhaps was the point. Gudrid didn't go to be noticed. She went to be changed, to see the world, to understand faith, to pray. She went, it seems, to complete something. Not a voyage of discovery, but a pilgrimage of understanding. And then she returned. The nun of the north. When Gudrid came home, she did something unusual. She gave her estate to her son, Snorri, and moved into a small house beside the church at Glomber. There, according to the saga, she became a sort of nun, not cloistered in the formal sense, but devoted to prayer, contemplation, and solitude. She lived quietly. Her role shifted from explorer to spiritual elder, from traveler to anchor. And perhaps this was her final voyage, the journey from a world of motion to a world of stillness. She died there, her body returned to the Icelandic soil where she was born. But her story improbably lived on. A life across worlds. Let's step back. Gudrid's life spanned Iceland, her birthplace and final resting place. Greenland, where she married, mourned, and endured. Vinland, where she gave birth to the first known European child in North America. Rome, the heart of the Christian world. Glomber, where she became a symbol of faith and legacy. This was not a life of conquest. It was a life of endurance. Her story is not often told in textbooks. Her name is not as famous as Leif Erikson. But she may have seen more of the world than any other Norse of her time. What makes a legacy? In medieval Europe, most women's names are lost. Yet Gudrid survives. She appears in two sagas, both naming her as wise, respected, and far-traveled. She is remembered not for the men she married, but for the life she led. And that is rare. She did not need to rule. She did not need to fight. She simply kept going, even when others turned back. A quiet lesson. As the fire fades and the longhouse sleeps, we're left with a question. What if history remembered more Gudrids and fewer kings? The longhouse at Glomber is still. Snow gathers on the turf roof. The stones at the church's foundation are slowly settling. Time moves gently here. The clatter of ships and the sea are far behind. So are the strange forests of Vinland and the white bones of Rome. Gudrid is gone now. But her story has not ended, not quite. This final section is about what we remember, what we find, and what survives not in saga or song but in the quiet persistence of place. It is a reflection on Gudrid's life after death, her family, her descendants, and the traces physical and spiritual she left behind. A life like hers does not vanish. It echoes. Snorri, the firstborn in a new world. Gudrid's son, Snorri Thorfinnsson, born in Vinland around the year 1005, was the first known person of European descent to be born in North America. He was not a prince. He was not a founder of cities or discoverer of new lands. But he was a bridge, a living thread between continents. Snorri was raised in Iceland on the Glomber estate. He grew to be a chieftain respected with lands and wealth. He had children. One of his sons, Thorgeir, became a priest. Another, Ungvald, became an abbess. And from these lines, generations of Icelanders would claim descent not just from Snorri, but from Gudrid herself. Some scholars believe that several prominent Icelandic bishops, scribes, and saga authors may have traced their lineage to her. Her blood moved through the centuries. Quietly, persistently. Glomber, where the story settled. The Glomber farm, nestled in a sheltered valley near the Skagafjörður fjord, is a real place. Today, it is a museum, one of the best preserved examples of a turf farmhouse in Iceland. The buildings date from the 18th and 19th centuries, but the land itself has been farmed since the Viking Age. It is believed, though not conclusively proven, that Gudrid once lived here. Near the site is a small, reconstructed church. Local tradition holds that it stands where Gudrid built her chapel after her return from Rome. It is simple, modest, wooden beams, a turf wall, quiet snow in winter, soft grass in summer. Here, visitors come not to see glory but to feel continuity, to imagine the shape of her days, to feel the weight of footsteps long erased. Remembered in saga. Gudrid appears in two of the great Icelandic sagas. The Saga of the Greenlanders. The Saga of Eric the Red. Both depict her with rare depth. She is not just a wife or mother, but a traveler, thinker, and survivor. She speaks, she prays, she offers counsel, she has visions. She is treated not as an ornament of someone else's story, but as a figure in her own right. This is remarkable. Very few women in medieval European literature are given such space. Even fewer are allowed to change, to grow from farm girl to explorer, mother, widow, pilgrim, and spiritual elder. That the sagas remember her at all is astonishing. That they remember her with respect is almost unheard of. The shape of a life. Let's take stock. Born in Iceland. Sailed to Greenland. Married twice. Survived illness, famine, and loss. Sailed to Vinland and gave birth. Returned to Iceland. Walked to Rome. Lived in quiet faith. Died in peace. This was not a life of conquest or empire. It was a life of resilience, marked not by fame but by persistence. Each movement was a response to hardship. Each step forward was a choice not to stop. A reflection in the present. Today, Gudrid is sometimes called the far-traveled. In Icelandic, Gudridur Thorbjarnardatir Vithfurla. She is remembered in books, statues, and occasionally school lessons. not as a symbol of domination, but as a woman who moved through the world with strength and grace. In 1935, a statue of her was erected at Glomberg. She holds a child in her arms, Snorri, and looks west. Not toward Rome, not even toward Iceland, but toward Vinland. It is a quiet statement that her story, like the wind and water she crossed, was never really about where she came from. It was about where she went and why she kept going. The final question. History often remembers names etched in stone: kings, warriors, destroyers. But sometimes, it's the people who survived, who simply endured, whose stories linger most. Gudrid left no empire, no saga of her own, no book of prayers, no burial mound with a carved stone. She left a life, lived across 3 continents. And so, we end this story with the question that follows her like a shadow. In a world that celebrates the loudest voices, how do we honor those who lived fully and left only footsteps? Story 6, Greenland's slow death, collapse of a Norse colony. There is no sound but wind. It rattles over ice-crusted hills. It hisses through empty halls. Once there were fires here, children's voices, the clang of iron, the smell of milk boiling over hearthstones. Now the turf walls lean. Snow drifts in doorways. Roof beams collapse under their own forgotten weight. This is Greenland, sometime in the 15th century. No ships arrive. No letters are sent. The Norse are disappearing and no one notices. In this story, there is no final battle, no volcanic doom, no invaders at the gates. There is only time, weather, and the slow erosion of hope. This is the story of how a medieval European colony vanished not in days or years, but over centuries. A story of survival and then of silence. The promise of Greenland. When Eric the Red settled Greenland around 985 CE, he gave it a name filled with promise. Groenland, Green Land. It was a marketing tactic. He wanted others to follow him west. And many did. Roughly 501,000 settlers, mostly from Iceland, came in longships, bringing sheep, cattle, and tools. They carved farms into narrow fjords along Greenland's southern coast. 2 major settlements formed. The eastern settlement, actually located in the southwest, near modern-day Qaqortoq. The western settlement, further north, near present-day Nuuk. Together, these communities formed the northernmost European outposts in the medieval world. They built churches, farms, laws, and families. They kept cattle, goats, and pigs. They grew barley, made butter and cheese, and hunted seals. They lived with relative stability for hundreds of years. But Greenland was always on the edge. Geographically, economically, spiritually. And eventually, the edge gave way. Life at the limits. To understand why Greenland's Norse colony collapsed, we must first understand how they lived. Their survival depended on a delicate balance. Pastoral farming, sheep and goats thrived during warmer decades. Hunting seals, walrus, caribou, and birds supplemented their diet. Trade with Iceland and Norway. They exchanged ivory, skins, and furs for iron, grain, and wood. For a time, the system worked. They built turf houses with wooden beams and sod roofs. They raised wooden churches, some of which still stand today in ruins. They observed Christian festivals, paid tithes to distant bishops, and buried their dead facing east. But they were isolated. Ships from Europe came only sporadically. Communication was slow, and their climate, always fragile, began to shift. The Little Ice Age begins. Around the 14th century, temperatures began to cool across the North Atlantic. This period is now known as the Little Ice Age. For Greenland, the impact was devastating. Growing seasons shortened. Sea ice increased. Storms worsened. Pasture land degraded. Suddenly, what had been marginal land became nearly unlivable. The Norse could no longer grow enough hay to feed livestock through winter. Sheep and cattle starved. Grain no longer ripened in the fields. Worse still, sea ice clogged fjords and harbors, cutting off contact with Europe. Trade diminished. Iron tools broke and could not be replaced. Wood became rare. They had once relied on walrus ivory as a major export to Europe. But by the 14th century, African elephant ivory was becoming more available and more desirable. Their economy collapsed quietly, one trade good at a time. Cultural inflexibility. The Norse of Greenland were resilient, but also culturally rigid. They maintained their Icelandic-style laws, Catholic faith, and European customs even when adaptation may have meant survival. Notably, they did not adopt the ways of the Inuit, who had arrived in Greenland from the north by the 13th century. The Inuit ancestors of today's Greenlandic people were masters of Arctic survival. They used kayaks and umiaks for hunting and transport, snow houses and skin tents for insulation, dog sleds, seal oil lamps, flexible diets based on whale, seal, and fish. The Norse had access to this knowledge. There were some contacts, occasional trade, or conflict, but no widespread integration. It's unclear why. Pride, religion, habit. Whatever the reason, they chose to remain European even as Europe forgot about them. The last written words. The final written record from Greenland's Norse is dated to 1408. It is a marriage record written in a church at Valsey in the eastern settlement. The church's stone ruins still stand. The document describes the marriage of Thorstein Olafsson and Sigrid Bjornsdottir, witnessed by people from Iceland and Greenland. It is formal, legal, and mundane. After that, nothing. No more letters, no more trade logs, no more records. It is as if the colony simply fell silent. And for 400 years, no one knew what happened. The skeletons in the soil. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Danish and Icelandic archaeologists rediscovered the sites of the eastern and western settlements. They found church ruins with gravestones and crosses, farmsteads with collapsed turf walls and middens filled with animal bones, tools, many broken, rusted, and unrepaired, human remains often malnourished. The burials told a quiet story. People had continued farming, attending church, burying their dead even as conditions worsened. There were no signs of mass death or violence. Just smaller families, thinner bones, simpler graves. Eventually, no graves at all. A cultural fading. The death without drama. Unlike Rome, Pompeii, or Carthage, Greenland's Norse colony did not fall in flame. It diminished. One family moved away. Another died in winter. A ship failed to arrive. A tool snapped and could not be mended. Over decades, the population dropped from thousands to hundreds, then perhaps to dozens. At last, none. No one wrote the ending. There was no chronicler, no priest to mark the final mass. Only wind, ice, silence. A closing reflection. The Norse of Greenland did not fail because they were weak. They lasted for nearly 500 years in one of the harshest environments on Earth. They built farms, raised children, worshipped, and traded. But the world changed, and they rooted in traditions, isolated by sea and time, could not change fast enough. So tonight we ask, is it more tragic to collapse in fire, or to be forgotten by degrees, one winter at a time? You wake up in a turf house. The air is sharp. Your breath fogs in front of your face. The light filtering through the narrow window is gray, and you hear no sound but the wind outside, pressing against the walls like a question with no answer. This is the 14th century in Greenland. You are part of a dwindling world. You do not know it yet, but you are living in the final generations of the Norse colony. There are fewer children each year, fewer ships, fewer songs. And still you rise. You feed the animals if they survive the winter. You churn the milk, repair the thatch, count the remaining nails. You go to church. You bury your dead. The world hasn't ended. It has simply gotten smaller. This section explores how life continued even as collapse crept in. It is about the slow unraveling, the emotional texture of dwindling returns, and the quiet resistance of people who stayed long after others would have left. The long winter. The winters grew longer. The little ice age already taking hold deepened. Ice sheets spread farther. Snow stayed longer. Spring came late and left early. For Norse farmers, this meant disaster. Hay crops failed. Cattle starved in barns. Soil froze deeper, eroding the thin layer of arable land they had carved into the fjords. Wood rotted and could not be replaced. Fuel for fire became precious. Archaeological evidence shows a shift in diet. Early bones show cattle, sheep, goat, European farming staples. Later layers show seal, fish, seabirds, indicating increasing reliance on marine sources. But even this had limits. Seal hunting required boats, strong hands, time, and a long walk to the shore, ice permitting. For every new adaptation, something else fell away. And still they stayed. The empty churches. Religion was central to Norse life in Greenland. At their peak, the settlements had over a dozen churches, monasteries, and cemeteries. They built them of turf and stone, with wooden crosses and simple altars. Some even had imported stained glass, now lost. But as the population dwindled, so did the congregations. Priests stopped arriving. Tithes could no longer be paid. Bishops back in Norway heard less and less. Still the people prayed. They buried their dead in Christian fashion, facing east, hands folded. At Valsey, one of the most famous Norse ruins, the last written document is a wedding certificate from 1408. The church still stood. Vows were exchanged. After that, nothing. No records, no second marriage, no funeral log, just absence. It's possible the final priest died there, buried beneath the very altar he once served. A diet of desperation. As the climate worsened, food security became a matter of luck. Some years the seal hunt went well. Other years the ice came early and blocked access to the coast. Crops failed. Trade ships didn't come. The Norse had no fishing tradition as extensive as the Inuit. Their boats were less suited to rough ice. They lacked the harpoons, kayaks, and tools optimized for cold sea hunting. Instead, they adapted in small ways. Boiled bones to extract fat. Used seabird eggs during nesting season. Ate seaweed and lichen in lean times. But famine still came. Skeletons recovered from later burials show signs of malnutrition, arthritis, and stunted growth. This wasn't one great famine, it was a long sequence of small ones. Hard years became the norm. The ghost of trade. Trade had once connected Greenland to the rest of the Norse world. Walrus ivory was their main export. In return, they imported iron tools, timber, grain, textiles. By the late 14th century, this network collapsed. Ivory demand dropped as African ivory reached Europe more reliably. The Hanseatic League, which dominated northern trade, had no interest in maintaining marginal outposts, and pirates and political instability made Atlantic voyages risky. Only a few ships are recorded during this time, some from Iceland, some possibly lost. Greenland became invisible. The Norse were left with what they had and what they could salvage. Some began to reuse broken iron. Others traded with Inuit neighbors in small, scattered exchanges. But tools dulled, clothes wore thin, rope frayed, nails rusted. Time, not violence, defeated them. Contact without connection. By the 13th century, the Inuit Thule culture had moved into western and northern Greenland. reaching areas once occupied by the Norse Western settlement. There's some evidence of contact, both peaceful and tense. The Norse built defensive walls around some farms, possibly out of fear. But artifacts suggest trade did occur. Iron tools found in Inuit sites and Inuit harpoon heads found in Norse middens. Still, there's little sign of deep cultural exchange. Why? Perhaps language stood in the way, or religion, or perhaps the Norse simply believed they didn't need to change. They remained culturally European, long after Europe had forgotten them. The decision to stay. At some point, one knows exactly when families began to leave. Not in mass exodus, but one by one. Some may have returned to Iceland. Some may have tried to sail to Norway. Some may have moved inland, disappeared into Inuit communities. Others may have died quietly, one winter at a time. But a few stayed. Archaeological digs show evidence of continued activity into the late 1400s. Farmhouses were maintained, churches were repaired, fields were grazed. They must have known help wasn't coming. And yet they remained. This is not failure, it's persistence. A dying flame. There is no last letter, no farewell, no graves with names and dates. Just an iron pot left on a hearth. A broken loom weight in a collapsed longhouse. The bones of a dog curled near a doorway. A spoon carved from driftwood, worn smooth by years of use. These were the final marks of a people who tried, again and again, to make Greenland home. They succeeded for nearly 5 centuries. And then they faded. A thought for the present. We often look to the past for climactic endings. But Greenland teaches us that history can end in accumulated stillness. That sometimes the most human story is the one where people hold on too long, because they love their home, because they fear the sea, because they believe somehow that things will get better. So we ask, is there more dignity in departure, or in staying, even as the world closes in around you? The long winter has no end. The final Norse family, whoever they were, walked the same paths, lit the same lamps, stirred the same soups as their ancestors had done for centuries. They whispered the same prayers. They opened the same door every morning and stepped out into a world that no longer answered back. And then, at some point in the 15th century, they were gone. No farewell message, no graves marked with dates, just silence settling over turf and stone. This final section is not about collapse, but about what remains, what we've learned, and what we still don't know. It's about the traces of Greenland's Norse left in the land, in the sagas, and in the minds of those who wonder what it means to survive quietly and disappear completely. The last settlement. Let's return to the Western settlement, near modern-day Nuuk. Archaeological surveys show that by the early 1400s it had been abandoned. Farms were deserted, churches stood empty, roofs caved in. The eastern settlement lasted slightly longer, perhaps into the 1460s, or even the early 1500s. Valsey Church, where the last recorded wedding took place in 1408, remained standing for centuries. Stone walls still rise from the grass today, silent and dignified, long outlasting the people who built them. Some theorize that a final generation moved inland, trying to survive off caribou and seal in the interior valleys. Others may have intermarried with the Inuit, disappearing into oral history rather than written record. No one knows. But the material evidence suggests a slow, fatting use of space. Roof beams salvaged and reused. Animal pens empty, then overgrown. Hearths gone cold but not destroyed. Final burials spaced years apart. Even in their ending, the Norse did not burn or flee. They simply remained until they couldn't anymore. Rediscovery and the Danish crown. Centuries passed. By the 17th century, Greenland was largely inhabited by Inuit communities. The Norse settlements had faded into legend. In Denmark and Iceland, vague memories persisted, stories of distant relatives who had never returned. In the early 1700s, a Lutheran missionary named Hans Egede petitioned the Danish king to send an expedition. He believed that lost Norse Christians might still be living in Greenland, cut off from the rest of Christendom. In 1721, he sailed there. What he found instead were Inuit, no Norse, no churches in use, no European speech, just ruins. The Norse had vanished. Egede's discovery sparked new archaeological interest and eventually a sense of loss, that a part of European Christendom had simply fallen off the map. Greenland was officially recolonized by Denmark in the 18th century, but the original Norse colony remained a ghost in memory, in stone, and in the sagas. The debate over why. Scholars still debate why the Norse colony in Greenland collapsed. Several key theories, none mutually exclusive, have emerged. 1. Climate change. The onset of the Little Ice Age made farming unsustainable. Shorter summers, colder winters, and advancing sea ice disrupted agriculture, trade, and seal hunting. 2. Economic isolation. As Europe's economy shifted, Greenland lost its trade relevance. With no iron, no wood, and no market for ivory, the colony became unviable. 3. Cultural inflexibility. Unlike the Inuit, the Norse clung to European customs and farming practices. They may have viewed Inuit practices as beneath them or pagan, missing vital survival strategies. 4. Conflict or disease. There is little evidence of violence, but it remains a possibility. Disease, especially in a weakened population, could have finished what hunger and cold began. 5. Gradual migration. It's possible that many simply left, returning to Iceland or integrating into Inuit society. In this case, the colony didn't collapse so much as dissolve. Most likely, it was all of the above. A slow weakening, a thinning out. The human element. Imagine a child born in Greenland around 1400. She would grow up in a smaller world than her grandparents, fewer neighbors, less food, a church without a priest, stories of Iceland, of Norway, but no ships in the harbor. She would learn to make do with what was left, worn tools, hand-me-downs, driftwood. Perhaps she'd ask her parents why the world seemed to be shrinking. Perhaps they'd say, "The ships will come next year." But they wouldn't. That child might grow up, marry, and give birth to one final generation before the family died out or drifted away. These were not failed people. They were resilient. They held on longer than anyone had reason to expect. And they left behind a lesson not in conquest, but in quiet resistance to an indifferent world. What remains? Today, visitors to Greenland can walk among the ruins. H. Valsey Church, still standing, its thick stone walls rising beside the fjord. Bradalid Erik the Red's farm, reconstructed with turf walls and a replica longhouse. Hundreds of turf outlines of forgotten farms, scattered across hillsides. They are empty but not lifeless. Every stone once held up a roof. Every hearth once warmed a family. Every bone in the ground was once a person who rose each morning to face another impossible day. And still they stayed. A final reflection. The story of Greenland's Norse colony is not dramatic. That's what makes it powerful. It's not a tale of war or betrayal, but of long decline. It is the sound of a house slowly rotting, a prayer said with no one listening, a candle lit each night until the last wick burns down. They did not conquer the land. They did not retreat in shame. They lived quietly on the edge of the world, until the world moved on without them. And so we ask, how do we measure success in years survived, or in names remembered? Story 7. The Forgotten War of the Hanseatic League. You've likely heard of the Vikings, of kings and crusades, of knights and empires. But have you ever heard of a war waged by merchants? Not for honor, not for glory, not even for land, but for salted fish. This is the forgotten story of the Hanseatic League, a network of merchant towns and cities that once dominated trade across the North and Baltic seas. At its height, the League was powerful enough to wage war, enforce blockades, and dictate terms to kings. But it did not fight like an empire, it fought like a business. And in the mid-14th century, the Hanseatic League went to war not with swords alone, but with shipping laws, harbor blockades, and economic strangulation. This is the story of a quiet war one fought over herring, tariffs, and maritime dominance. A war with no famous generals, but long-lasting consequences. What was the Hanseatic League? Before we dive into the conflict, we must understand what the Hanseatic League actually was and what it was not. It wasn't a country. It wasn't an empire. It had no king, no central army, no standing navy. Instead, the Hanseatic League, often just called the Hansa, was a confederation of merchant guilds and market towns, primarily along the coastlines of what are now Germany, Poland, the Netherlands, the Baltic states, and into Scandinavia. Formed in the 12th century and flourishing by the 13th and 14th, the Hansa's primary mission was simple: protect trade, suppress piracy, negotiate privileges abroad. By the 1350s, it included over 200 towns, with major centers in Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen, Danzig, Gdansk, Riga, and Tallinn. It dominated trade in grain from Poland and Russia, timber and tar from Scandinavia, furs from the north, salted fish, beer, and cloth from northern Europe, salt, wine, and luxuries from the south. Think of it as a proto-European union, but run by shopkeepers. And when its interests were threatened, it could get mean. Brewing conflict, England and the League. In the 14th century, England was growing into a rising power not just militarily, but economically. The wool trade and shipbuilding industries were booming. English merchants, emboldened by royal support, began challenging Hanseatic privileges in English ports. Tensions rose. English merchants demanded more influence in London, where Hanseatic merchants had long enjoyed special tax-free trade rights. English ships began muscling into Baltic trade, where the Hansa traditionally controlled access. English officials tried to tax or expel Hansa agents in England. The Hanseatic towns, especially Lübeck and Hamburg, were furious. But they didn't send armies. They tightened trade routes. They blacklisted ports. And they began preparing fleets, not warships, but armed merchant vessels capable of protecting convoys and enforcing blockades. The League was about to fight, not for pride but for market share. The role of fish, yes, really. If this sounds unimportant, war over trade roots it's worth pausing on a key commodity: herring. In the medieval Catholic world, meat was forbidden on many religious days. Fish, especially salted fish, became essential. The waters around Scania, southern Sweden, hosted massive herring runs every autumn. Thousands of fishermen gathered. Salting and drying operations sprang up. For a few weeks each year, the coast transformed into a bustling market town. Control of this fish trade meant control of Europe's food chain and its wallets. The Hanseatic League monopolized the herring markets. They set prices, they regulated salt, they excluded outsiders. When English, Dutch, and Danish merchants tried to break in, they were met with embargoes, tariffs, and outright violence. This wasn't just about fish, it was about power. The Fish War and beyond. Between the 1360s and 1370s, things boiled over. What followed became known as the Hanseatic-Danish War, but it involved far more than Denmark. Here's the setup. King Valdemar IV of Denmark tried to centralize control over the Scania herring trade, imposing higher tolls and favoring Danish merchants. Hanseatic towns objected vehemently. In 1361, the Danes seized Visby, a key Hansa port on Gotland. The League responded by declaring war. Yes, a commercial confederation declared war on a king. They formed a naval alliance with Sweden and Mecklenburg, assembled a fleet not of war galleons, but of armed cogs and merchant ships, blockaded Danish ports, seized Danish shipping, funded pirates known as Vikingbrüder to raid enemy harbors. This was war, but war as waged by accountants. The Treaty of Stralsund, 1370. After nearly a decade of conflict, Denmark was brought to the negotiating table. The result, the Treaty of Stralsund, a massive diplomatic victory for the League. Key terms: the League gained control over several Danish fortresses for 15 years. They received expanded trade privileges across Danish territory. The Danish king agreed to consult the League before appointing future monarchs. Think about that. A group of merchants forced a European king to give them veto power over succession. It was arguably the high point of Hanseatic power. No blood-soaked battlefield, no crown taken, just a ledger adjusted in the League's favor. Merchants or rulers? By the end of the 14th century, the Hanseatic League had become more than a trade network. It was a diplomatic force, a naval presence, and a kingmaker in northern Europe. But with power came problems. Some cities grew too wealthy and stopped following League policy. Others feared the League was becoming too political. External powers England, the Netherlands, Scandinavia learned from the League, building their own merchant fleets. Piracy and war became more expensive. Still, for a time, the League stood astride the Baltic like a colossus. And no one, not even kings, could move goods through the north without their permission. An unfinished ledger. Tonight, the record sits silent in Lübeck's archives. Hundreds of dusty ledgers, goods traded, ships launched, deals struck, treaties signed. All because a few towns decided to work together to protect their profits, yes, but also to build a system. And when that system was threatened, they fought not with banners and glory but with contracts, blockades, and well-aimed tariffs. So now we ask, is this still war if no one remembers the fighting? The sea is calm, the sails are full, and on the horizon a ship approaches, not flying a royal banner but bearing the colors of a city guild. Its crew are not knights or soldiers but sailors with ledgers, knives, and contracts. This is not a navy. It is a merchant convoy of the Hanseatic League. But make no mistake, if you cross them, they will make war. And so, as we enter the second part of this story, we turn to the century that followed the Treaty of Stralsund, a time of growing power but also growing enemies. The Hanseatic League had triumphed over Denmark. It now controlled large parts of Baltic trade, had military leverage, and wielded diplomatic influence in northern courts. But power, like grain, spoils if not carefully managed. And the League, born of cooperation, was now grappling with greed, pirates, and politics. Enter the Vikingbrüder, pirates for hire. After their victory in the 1370s, the Hanseatic cities began hearing privateers, legal pirates known as the Vikingbrüder, or Victual Brothers. Their task? To disrupt Danish shipping, enforce League embargoes, and ensure that the terms of peace were obeyed. At first it worked, but pirates, once unleashed, are not easily reined in. By the 1390s, the Vikingbrüder had turned from hired agents to freelance raiders, establishing bases in the Baltic, most notably on the island of Gotland. From there they attacked merchant vessels, coastal towns, even League ships. Their allegiance was fluid. Their motivation was profit, and their presence undermined the very trade networks the League had tried to protect. In a cruel twist, the League had helped create the very threat it now faced. Internal fractures, cities in conflict. As the 15th century began, cracks appeared within the League. Not all cities shared the same priorities. Lübeck, the de facto leader, prioritized control over Baltic shipping lanes. Cologne focused on trade with England and France. Danzig and Riga leaned eastward, toward Poland and Russia. These differing interests led to policy disputes. Should they continue naval patrols? Should they back certain monarchs? Should they enforce trade embargoes that hurt one member more than others? Moreover, not all cities benefited equally from the League's military campaigns. Smaller towns resented paying for wars they did not profit from. The League's strength had always been its unity. But now, as cities grew rich and powerful, that unity began to fray. Foreign competition rises. While the League quarreled, other powers rose. One, the Dutch. Dutch merchants, especially from Amsterdam, began building faster, more efficient ships like the Flight, and trading directly with Baltic ports. They undercut Hanseatic prices and bypassed their middlemen. 2. The English. Despite the League's dominance in London Steelyard, its trading outpost, English merchants pushed back. Parliament and the Crown granted new privileges to native traders. Hanseatic goods were taxed, and their special exemptions challenged. 3. The Scandinavians. After Denmark reunited with Sweden and Norway under the Kalmar Union, the League's enemies were stronger and more unified. Queen Margaret I of Denmark, R. 1387-1412, was particularly hostile to Hanseatic interference. She reasserted royal control over the Scania fish markets and began pushing League merchants out. The Treaty of Utrecht, 1474. By the mid-15th century, open war had given way to cold trade wars, tariff disputes, embargoes, and diplomatic sparring. In 1474, the Hanseatic League signed the Treaty of Utrecht with England. This treaty re-established many of the League's old privileges in English ports and confirmed the Steelyard's status in London. It was a partial victory, but it came at a cost. The treaty marked a shift from dominance to negotiated relevance. It also acknowledged England's growing influence, and it revealed the League's dependence on the goodwill of foreign rulers. The merchants, once feared and autonomous, now had to bargain, not dictate. The Steelyard in London, a fortress of commerce. One of the League's most iconic symbols during this era was the Steelyard, its fortified trade base in London. Located near modern-day Cannon Street Station, the Steelyard functioned as a warehouse for goods like wax, furs, grain, and beer, a customs point with tax privileges, a residence for Hanseatic merchants, a miniature city-state with its own laws and guards. For English merchants, it was a thorn and enclave of foreign influence in their capital. For the Hanseatic League, it was a lifeline, the gateway to Western markets. By the 16th century, however, its importance was fading. Royal favor turned toward local traders. The Reformation disrupted ties, and in 1598, Queen Elizabeth I revoked the League's privileges in England. The Steelyard was closed. The League's western anchor was gone. Fading influence. As the 16th century wore on, the League's grip continued to loosen. The rise of nation-states replaced decentralized networks. The printing press and Protestant Reformation undermined old alliances. New Atlantic trade routes pulled commerce toward the west, toward Spain, Portugal, and later, the Americas. Cities like Amsterdam, Antwerp, and London grew into dominant global centers. By 1669, the Hanseatic League held its final official meeting in Lübeck, with only a few cities attending. There was no dramatic fall. No war. Just silence. What was left behind? The League's influence didn't vanish completely. Many of its cities, Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen, remained prosperous. Its legacy lived on in trade law, maritime codes, insurance practices, and customs regulations. Architecture, red brick Gothic buildings and warehouses across northern Europe. Civic identity. Even today, Bremen and Hamburg are known as free Hanseatic cities. Economic precedent. The idea of a confederation of equals, bound not by land but by shared interest. It was not an empire, but for centuries it shaped the economy of northern Europe. A closing thought. The Hanseatic League never crowned a king, never forged a sword of state, never marched under a single banner. Its battles were fought in courtrooms, on ledgers at docks. It rose not through conquest, but through cooperation, and it fell when that cooperation could no longer hold. So we ask, what happens when the balance sheet replaces the battlefield, and still you lose the war? The harbor is quiet. The flags of Lübeck still fly, but fewer ships come and go. Warehouses once stacked with wax, wool, and rye now hold echoes. Meetings of the League are sparsely attended. Decisions are delayed. The proud seal of the Hanseatic League, once stamped on treaties, privileges, and blockades, is now mostly used on internal correspondence. The great merchant confederation is still alive, but it is fading. This final section brings us into the League's long twilight, its last embers of power, the final attempts at unity, and the enduring legacy left behind. Because not every empire ends in flames. Some simply close their books. The end of expansion. By the early 1500s, the Hanseatic League was still functioning, but no longer dominant. Its last attempt at expansion came in the 16th century. The League tried to reassert privileges in Norway and England, re-establish influence in the Baltic, combat piracy and foreign competition. But the world had changed. Nation-states now dictated trade policy. Royal navies patrolled coasts. National monopolies, like England's Muscovy Company and the Dutch VOC, replaced city-based guilds. And the League's old model, negotiating as a coalition of towns, no longer held weight in a world ruled by crowns. The League structure, once flexible and effective, became its weakness. Without central leadership, its member towns acted in their own interests. Some signed separate trade treaties, others joined new alliances. A few simply ignored the League altogether. Its power slipped away, not in war but in irrelevance. A ghost in the ledger. By the 17th century, the League still existed on paper. Town councils still met. Letters were still signed on behalf of the Hanse. A few merchants still claimed Hanseatic privileges. But this was a fiction. The League no longer dictated policy. It no longer enforced blockades. It no longer had the means or the will to go to war. In 1669, the League held what is considered its last General Assembly in Lübeck. Only 9 cities attended. Most had sent only minor delegates. No new decisions were made. No battles were planned. There was no formal declaration of disbandment, just a quiet closing of the books. The Hanseatic League faded into the footnotes of history. What endures? Despite its disappearance, the Hanseatic League left a deep imprint on Europe. 1. Urban independence. The League championed the autonomy of cities. Many member towns maintained their freedom from feudal lords, serving as models of republican governance in a world dominated by monarchies. Cities like Hamburg and Bremen continue to bear the title Free Hanseatic City today. 2. Trade networks and infrastructure. The League helped create a pan-European infrastructure of warehouses, ports, standardized weights and measures, legal norms for shipping and insurance. These laid the groundwork for modern commercial law. 3. Cultural exchange. From Bruges to Novgorod, the League connected people, goods, and ideas. A merchant from Lübeck could do business in Tallinn or Bergen, speak the local dialect, and pay with weights everyone agreed on. It was a commercial lingua franca, centuries before the EU. 4. Architecture and heritage. Walk through Lübeck, Wismar, Stralsund, or Danzig today, and you'll see the red brick Gothic of Hanseatic wealth, stepped gables, tall warehouses, and stone guild halls. They are not ruins. They are working cities built on the bones of a merchant empire. The Steelyard's last stones. Even in London, long after Queen Elizabeth revoked the League's privileges in 1598, the Steelyard was remembered. Its buildings were finally demolished in the 19th century, making way for a railway station. But excavations uncovered medieval iron scales, Hanseatic coinage, fragments of contracts, seals, and merchant logs, the bones of bureaucracy, the detritus of commerce, an empire of contracts remembered only in paper and brick. A war worth forgetting. The Hanseatic League did not fight dramatic wars. There were no great generals or sweeping campaigns. Their battles were fought in backrooms, shipyards, and council halls. But that didn't make them unimportant. The Hanseatic-Danish War, the embargoes on England, the pirate battles in the Baltic, these weren't flashy, but they shaped how Europe functioned for centuries. Their victories were measured in trade agreements, maritime law, and economic influence. And in the end, their downfall came not through invasion, but through evolution. The world moved on, the League could not. A final reflection. In history, we often honor the conquerors. But the Hanseatic League teaches us that power can be silent, that control can be exercised through customs agents, not crusades, that an alliance of merchants, acting together, can build something more lasting than the sword. For hundreds of years, the League helped shape the flow of goods, money, and people across a divided continent. It provided stability in times of chaos, rules in times of greed, and cooperation in an age of conquest. And so we ask, is there a kind of greatness in being forgotten when your work helped build the modern world? Story 8. When bread broke empires, the grain riots of ancient Rome. You may not expect the course of history to hinge on something as simple as grain, but in ancient Rome, bread wasn't just food, it was politics, survival, and control. And when it disappeared, the city burned. In this story, we look not at emperors or generals, but at the hungry masses of Rome, how a missing loaf of bread could spark riots, topple officials, and even shake the foundations of empire. This is the slow-burning tale of Rome's grain crises, the fragile logistics behind feeding 1 million people, and the riots that followed when that system faltered. The grain of the empire. At its height in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, Rome had over 1 million inhabitants, the largest city in the ancient world. But the city's prosperity came with a dangerous dependency. It could not feed itself. The land around Rome was insufficient for feeding its growing population. Instead, the city became reliant on imported grain, particularly wheat, the staple used to make bread, porridge, and gruel. Each year, hundreds of thousands of tons of grain were imported from Egypt, the breadbasket of the empire, supplying up to 1/3 of Rome's wheat. North Africa, especially modern-day Tunisia and Algeria. Sicily, Sardinia, southern Gaul. The system was vast, bureaucratic, and fragile. And when it failed, even for a few weeks, people starved. Annona, Rome's food supply system. The Roman government called its grain supply the Annona, from the goddess Annona, who personified the city's food supply. The Annona was a state-managed logistics system, operating like a centralized welfare office, global shipping company, and emergency management bureau all in one. It involved taxing provinces in kind, especially Egypt and Africa, which paid tribute in grain, using state-owned ships and chartered merchants to carry grain to Rome, storing grain in massive granaries near the Tiber, distributing it to hundreds of thousands of eligible citizens through the grain dole, or fermentatio. At times, the state gave the grain for free, a politically popular but financially risky move. At other times, citizens had to pay a subsidized price. But one thing was clear. If the grain ships didn't come, Rome would riot. The fragile grain chain. Rome's grain supply was precariously dependent on weather. Bad harvests in Egypt or storms in the Mediterranean delayed or destroyed shipments. Pirates. The Mediterranean was not always safe, and piracy remained a real threat. Politics. Unrest in grain-producing regions disrupted exports. Bureaucracy. Delays in tax collection, loading, and shipping caused bottlenecks. And because Rome operated on a just-in-time system, even a short delay could mean long bread lines and empty markets. Officials who failed to manage the annona efficiently faced public rage, riots, and political ruin. Some even lost their lives. The first grain riots, a city's fury. As early as the late Republic, food shortages sparked urban unrest. In 57 BCE, a particularly bad crisis unfolded. Grain prices soared. People took to the streets. The Senate, under intense pressure, passed a law creating a new office. The praefectus annoni, the official in charge of the grain supply. To fill the role, they chose Pompey the Great, one of Rome's most powerful men. He was given extraordinary powers not just over grain but over ports, warehouses, and supply routes. His task: feed the city fast. Pompey succeeded barely, but the crisis had made a lasting impression. Bread could bring down the Republic, the dole, and the people. By the time of Augustus, 27 BCE, 14 CE, the grain dole became institutionalized. Augustus reduced the number of eligible recipients from 320,000 to about 200,000, but the state continued to guarantee a grain supply for a significant portion of the city's male citizens. This wasn't charity, it was social control. The dole kept the poor satisfied and politically docile. It also tied them to the emperor's favor. Any ruler who failed to maintain it risked mass unrest. Bread was no longer just food. It was a tool of power. And the emperors knew it. The Claudius crisis, a rioting city. In 41 CE, the Emperor Claudius faced one of the worst grain crises of the imperial period. A delay in grain shipments from Egypt caused shortages in Rome. Grain prices spiked. Bread ran out. Riots broke out in the streets. According to the historian Suetonius, an angry mob stormed the imperial palace, screaming at Claudius and threatening to kill him. The emperor fled. It was one of the closest Rome ever came to deposing a ruler over bread. Claudius responded by importing more grain at government expense, increasing the size of the grain fleet, building new harbor infrastructure at Portus, just west of Rome, to improve grain shipping capacity, penalizing merchants who failed to deliver grain on time, rewarding those who did. It was a wake-up call, and it showed the terrifying reality that the food supply could bring down emperors. Free bread, free entertainment. Later emperors tied the grain dole to another powerful force: public entertainment. Hence the phrase, panem et circenses, bread and circuses. The idea was simple. Feed the people. Distract them with games. Keep them from revolting. The Circus Maximus, gladiator games, chariot races, these were all part of the same system of public management as the annona. But all of it hinged on one thing: grain. Without bread, the circus meant nothing. Without food, the city turned violent. And so the emperors, regardless of their ideology, all became servants of the grain supply. Even tyrants had to keep the ovens running. A system under pressure. By the 2nd century CE, the Annona was under increasing strain. The population of Rome remained high. The dole expanded to include other cities in the empire. The naval logistics became more complex. Political instability made the provinces less predictable. Worse still, the empire faced epidemics, inflation, and military overreach. Emperors came and went with alarming frequency. In this chaos, food shipments became even more vital and even more precarious. In the late 3rd century, the grain supply began to diversify, with some foodstuffs coming from southern Gaul or the eastern provinces. But Egypt remained key. If something happened there, Rome would go hungry. And when hunger came, so did the riots. A question in the air. Tonight, as you lie in the dark and picture the crowded streets of ancient Rome, imagine a market square where bread prices have doubled overnight. A baker with no loaves left. A mother with no coin and no flour. A crowd growing louder, more desperate, more dangerous. This isn't history from the top down. This is history from the stomach up. And so we ask, what happens when an empire forgets how to feed its people? The Tiber moves slowly, but Rome's needs are constant. By the 3rd century CE, the city of Rome was still home to hundreds of thousands, perhaps not the million of Augustus's time, but enough to keep the grain ships sailing. Every loaf of bread still depended on distant harvests, merchant fleets, and a bureaucracy that strained under its own complexity. But now the empire was beginning to fracture. This section dives deeper into how Rome attempted to maintain control over its grain supply during times of political chaos, civil war, and administrative overreach, and how the same system meant to preserve peace could spark unrest when it began to collapse. A shifting center of power. After the crisis of the 3rd century, 235–284 CE, Rome was no longer the uncontested heart of the empire. New imperial centers rose: Mediolanum, Milan, Trier, Nicomedia, and later Constantinople, all closer to the empire's military frontiers. But Rome remained symbolically powerful. It was still fed, still entitled to the grain dole, even if emperors no longer lived there. Maintaining the food supply became an obligation of legitimacy for emperors hoping to keep the Roman populace content and quiet. The problem was that the logistics no longer matched the politics. The system depended on a functioning Egyptian grain harvest, stable North African provinces, safe shipping routes, trustworthy administrators. As imperial attention drifted eastward and internal chaos mounted, this system began to rot from within. The reforms of Diocletian. By the end of the 3rd century, Rome faced runaway inflation, grain shortages, and rising civil unrest. In response, Emperor Diocletian, r. 284–305 CE, attempted to reinvent the Roman economy. Key measures included fixing maximum prices for goods, including grain, through the Edict on Maximum Prices, 301 CE. Reorganizing provincial administration to improve tax collection in grain. Replacing some grain payments with monetary equivalents, an effort to streamline supply. Rebuilding infrastructure to improve movement of goods. These reforms were ambitious but deeply flawed. Price fixing backfired. Grain continued to be hoarded or sold on the black market. Provincial officials, under pressure to meet quotas, engaged in corruption and extortion. Meanwhile, the urban population of Rome, accustomed to subsidized or free food, grew increasingly resentful of reduced distributions. The threat of food riots loomed over every failed shipment. The rise of Africa. By the 4th century CE, the North African provinces, particularly the area around Carthage, had become the empire's new breadbasket. Egypt remained vital but politically unstable. North Africa fertile, relatively secure, and closer to Italy took over much of the burden of feeding Rome. The grain fleets from Carthage sailed to Portus, Rome's main port by then, where grain was unloaded into enormous warehouses and eventually distributed to the people. But this too was fragile. If Berber tribes raided inland fields, or if imperial administrators failed to protect shipping routes, the consequences were immediate. Grain shipments were tracked like military campaigns. Even a 2-week delay could mean panic. Riots under Constantine. Emperor Constantine the Great, r. 306–337 CE, understood the value of controlling the grain supply. While he focused on building his new eastern capital, Constantinople, he ensured that Rome's grain rations continued, even if reluctantly. But even during his reign, food unrest persisted. Contemporary sources describe riots over bread prices, clashes between urban poor and merchants accused of price gouging, public attacks on granaries and bakeries during shortages, governors punished or lynched when supplies failed. Even emperors were not safe. In 327 CE, Constantine himself was reportedly forced to intervene in Rome after bread riots spiraled beyond local control. His response: reinforce the grain dole temporarily and increase surveillance on shipping and storage. But long-term, his sights were on Constantinople. Rome would slowly slide from priority to problem. Constantinople and the split supply. With the founding of Constantinople in 330 CE, the Annona system was duplicated. Now there were two capitals in need of food security. Rome fed mainly from Africa. Constantinople fed primarily from Egypt. This division of grain routes created a dual dependency. If either region failed, its city suffered. By the late 4th century, Rome's population was declining, but its entitlement to grain persisted. Constantinople's population was rising, and the grain demand with it. Provinces were reassigned based on which city they supplied. The result was a complicated logistical balancing act, overseen by prefects, fleets, and local governors, none of whom had complete control. Grain became a currency of imperial loyalty. Rewards for allies, punishment for rebels, and when disrupted, a trigger for street violence. The sack of Rome, 410 CE. In 410 CE, Rome was sacked by the Visigoths under Alaric, the first time in 800 years that a foreign enemy entered the city. But what is often overlooked is why the sack happened. It wasn't just ambition or vengeance. It was hunger. Alaric demanded grain and payment from the Roman Senate. His army needed food. The empire failed to meet his terms. Negotiations broke down. And Rome, weakened by famine and poor defense, fell. Contemporary reports describe a city already suffering from hunger before the gates opened. Bread once again lay at the center of catastrophe. Not just riots now, but collapse. The grain riots of late antiquity. Even after the Western Empire fell in 476 CE, Rome, now under Ostrogothic and later Byzantine control, continued to suffer from periodic bread riots. In 537 CE, during the Gothic War, the Eastern Roman general Belisarius struggled to feed the population of Rome while under siege. Food ran low, riots broke out, grain shipments were blocked. The Annona, centuries old by now, was finally breaking. Not with a bang, but under the weight of its own inflexibility. The days of guaranteed grain were ending. Rome was no longer the center of the empire. It was a city without enough bread and without the power to demand it. A final question. Imagine a system so vast, so intricate, that it keeps millions alive. Now imagine it buckling piece by piece from politics, corruption, and time. That was Rome's grain supply, a marvel of logistics, a tool of empire, and a warning about how fragile the most basic needs can be. So we ask, when the empire's might depends on a daily loaf, what happens when the ovens go cold? The ovens are empty, the granaries are hollow, and the line outside the bakery has turned from a crowd to a mob. In this final section, we explore how Rome's centuries-long struggle to feed its people culminated not just in riots and instability, but in a cultural and political redefinition of power itself. This isn't just a story about bread. It's about the long shadow that bread cast over law, governance, and empire, and how even as the empire fell, its need to control food never did. The grain dole ends. By the 6th century CE, the grain dole in Rome, the once mighty fermentatio, was a pale shadow of its former self. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE did not bring an immediate collapse of the food system. Odoacer, the barbarian ruler who replaced the last Western emperor, maintained the grain distributions, knowing full well that bread meant power. But maintaining the annona without the backing of a stable imperial tax system proved impossible. The North African provinces, Rome's breadbasket, fell to the Vandals in the 5th century. Egyptian grain was rerouted to Constantinople, the new imperial center. Roman roads and shipping lanes crumbled from lack of investment and war. Local grain storage facilities were looted, destroyed, or simply neglected. By the time Belisarius reoccupied Rome for the Byzantine Empire in the 530s, the city's infrastructure had degraded beyond recovery. The fermentatio was not formally abolished. It just stopped working. Constantinople, bread in the east. As Rome withered, Constantinople rose. Founded by Constantine in 330 CE, the city had grown into a bustling capital by the 6th century, housing nearly 500,000 people. And like Rome before it, it relied on grain imports mostly from Egypt and Anatolia. Emperors such as Justinian I continued the Roman tradition of distributing free or subsidized bread to the urban poor. The annona system lived on in the East, refined, expanded, and digitized, in record-keeping if not in technology. But Constantinople also inherited Rome's tensions. Grain riots occurred during shortages or after poor harvests. Citizens still attacked bakeries, officials, and grain barges during lean years. Political rivals used food disruptions to undermine emperors or gain support. The most infamous of these episodes came in 532 CE with the Nika riots. The Nika riots, when bread met politics. The Nika riots were not caused by food shortages, but they occurred in a city where bread remained the lifeline of public stability. Tensions between rival chariot factions, the Blues and the Greens, exploded into 6 days of street violence. Over 30,000 people died. Parts of the city burned. What united the crowd was discontent with taxes, with corruption, and yes, with bread prices. Emperor Justinian only retained his throne through a bloody crackdown. Afterward, he reorganized the city's grain supply, built more bakeries, and strengthened control over the distribution bureaucracy. Even in moments of political catastrophe, the importance of feeding the people could not be ignored. Bread and the Byzantine state. In the centuries that followed, the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire continued to distribute grain or bread in times of need or as rewards for loyalty. The old fermentatio system was replaced with more targeted distributions and urban feeding programs for orphans, the poor, civil servants, soldiers. Bakeries in Constantinople were regulated by the state, with grain supplies monitored closely. Failure to supply bread at the correct price or in the correct quantity remained grounds for riots well into the 9th and 10th centuries. Though the Annona no longer existed in its imperial form, the principle endured. Feed the people or face the crowd. The medieval inheritance. Even after the Byzantine system began to fragment, the legacy of Rome's food supply system lived on in Europe's cities. Medieval cities from Paris to Milan created municipal grain reserves, often inspired by Roman examples. In times of famine or siege, local lords and bishops were expected to provide grain from public stores. Food riots remained a common form of protest, often seen not as criminal, but as a legitimate form of collective negotiation. The expectation that the state or someone should guarantee access to food was one of the most enduring Roman political legacies. Bread as political contract. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the Annona was the idea that a ruler's legitimacy could hinge on their ability to feed the people. In Rome, emperors rose and fell on the success of the grain fleets. Claudius nearly lost his life in a riot. Pompey gained immense power through food control. Alaric sacked Rome after grain demands were ignored. Constantine secured his Eastern Empire by replicating Rome's food systems. In every case, food was not a background detail. It was the mechanism through which rulers maintained authority, bought loyalty, and avoided rebellion. And for the people, bread was a right, not a luxury. This social contract, bread for peace, would echo through centuries. Echoes today. Look at modern history, and you'll still see its influence. The French Revolution was sparked, in part, by bread shortages and rising flour prices. In World War I, the German population suffered from a naval blockade that starved cities of bread and potatoes, leading to political upheaval. The Arab Spring began in countries where staple food prices had spiked dramatically. We still riot over bread. We still protest when food becomes unaffordable. And we still expect those in power to guarantee, at the very least, that no one goes hungry. A final reflection. The Romans understood something we often forget. You can conquer the world, but you cannot govern a hungry city. They built temples, roads, aqueducts, and empires. But in the end, the promise of a daily loaf proved as important as any law or legion. So tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine a ship rounding the bend at Portus. Its hull is full, the crowds are waiting, the ovens will burn again. And the empire for another day survives. So we ask, in the end, is it grain, not gold, that holds an empire together?